Hello everyone and welcome back for the MARRES Symposium. We are on session 4 this afternoon here, a session that will be on fisheries and environmental economics. Hello students, late. It's good, it's first year students. Second year students are much more stressed, almost, sorry. So this afternoon we will have the pleasure to hear about fisheries and environmental economics with Taylor, Maryann, Emma, Julie, and David. A little bit more in details, Maryann will talk about fisheries and economy, Taylor about fisheries and MPA, Emma about mercury in the Mediterranean, Julie about fisheries and MPA as well, and David about MPA, especially more in the Indian Ocean. So here we have a jury that I will introduce just after. But also, I would like to officially thank all the reviewers who have done a big job of reviewing the papers of your master thesis. So in this session, I thank Hubert Bonnefond, Bernard Sinclair, Jean-Christophe Martin, Aldine Amiel, Elena Bovio, Frédéric Villers, and Louisa Manguelajo. In this session, the jury this afternoon, thank you for being here. We've got Jean-Vincent Vieux-Ingrassa, who is coming with the views of biology high school teacher, but also an active member of Nature Dive. Elena Bovio from Université Côte d'Azur Laboratoire in RA. Hubert Bonnefond, Université Côte d'Azur Laboratoire in RIA. And Aldine Amiel, Laboratoire IRCAN, also from Université Côte d'Azur. As I say, we will start with Taylor, so it's time to welcome you, Taylor. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So, Taylor, you're with the distance. The students will join us on site. Taylor, as usual, the big question is, where are you?
I'm in the Philippines right now, in Mindoro. It's not very late. It's only 8 p.m.
It was close. So, Taylor, as you know, you're going to have 50 minutes for your presentation. So do you have a countdown with you?
Yes, I do.
Yes, okay. And this 15 minutes will be followed by something like 20 minutes of questions from the jury.
Okay.
So we'll have a look to your screen. It seems all good. And we can start when you want.
Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Taylor Bratton, and today I will be sharing with you my thesis on the social and physical drivers of compliance in Belize's marine reserves. So first, I'll start with an introduction. I'll move on to what I did and how I did it. I will discuss my results with my discussion and provide some conclusions and solutions. Small-scale fisheries are not only an important nutrient source for coastal communities, but they also affirm cultural values such as sense of place, identity, and purpose. They support more livelihoods per ton than industrial fisheries. They're less wasteful, more direct, and more efficient. But these communities are more vulnerable to environmental changes because they're reliant on primary resources. The FAO describes Belize's fisheries sector as small-scale and artisanal. So Belize excels when compared to the global standard of tropical fisheries management. And this is mostly due to the Managed Access Program implemented in 2011, which partitions the country's waters into 9 zones. Fishers are allocated 2 zones in which they can fish that are demarcated by stripes on the sides of their boats. Dividing up a commons resource increases fishers' advocacy and stewardship for their fishing areas. Not only does Belize have managed access, but it also harbors an extensive network of MPAs, including no-take zones, which make up 7.61% of their waters. So there are 3 commercial fisheries in Belize: conch, lobster, and finfish. Conch and lobster are more for international distribution, and consequently, they have more strict regulations concerning their size, the type of gear, and open and closed seasons. Finfish are more for domestic consumption, meaning that they have less regulations associated with their catch. So there are 3 main fishing communities in Belize. Skiff fishermen are primarily fishing for finfish, and they use hand lines and spear guns. They'll drive their motorized vessels to their fishing sites and stay for 1 to 2 days. Camp fishermen predominantly stay in semi-permanent fishing camps on the offshore atolls and keys of Belize, and they are mostly lobster fishermen. So they hold large territories and have high investments in their traps and shades, which are more sophisticated gear than the other communities usually use. Northern fishermen are Spanish-speaking mestizo communities from the north of Belize, whose culture is centralized around the fishing industry. They sail their traditional sailboats to their fishing grounds, and they'll stay offshore for around 2 weeks, and they'll have up to 8 people on their boats. The fishermen take their small canoes and they dive for conch and lobster. So conservation is more about managing people than it is about managing the environment. Even in the global case study for tropical small-scale fisheries management, non-compliance is still a prevalent issue. Free riders who commit infractions and get away with it compromise the integrity of the marine reserve network. So why do people fish illegally? Well, first, let's define some terms. So compliance is an individual's ability or willingness to abide by regulations. And this is the keystone of conservation. A regulation might seem effective, but if it's not followed, then it's ineffective. Compliance is also very difficult to monitor and measure. Enforcement is expensive, and committing crimes is taboo. So it's difficult to get actual information on this. Actual compliance can only be measured by the infractions caught, not the infractions committed. So how do we measure this? Well, we can use perceived compliance, which is the amount of illegal activity a person believes to be happening in their fishing area. And the consensus is that a person's relationship to to illegal fishing in their area directly reflects their own compliance. And this is related to the tragedy of the commons. If a person catches an undersized fish, they might feel that if they throw it back, they're just leaving it for the next person. So there are a number of physical drivers of compliance in MPAs. And the first is the age of the MPA. People take time to adjust to change, especially if the area they've always fished in becomes a no-take zone. Enforcement is the conventional antidote to noncompliance. And this is when officials ensure that people are following the rules. But this brings up the issue of coerced compliance. Are they only following the rules because they're swayed by the risk of fines or imprisonment? And lastly, MPA size is a function of enforcement. Larger MPAs are more difficult to patrol. So there are some social drivers here that I'd like to discuss, and the first is satisfaction. When fishers are satisfied with regulations, they're more likely to voluntarily comply because they genuinely agree with the rules, especially if they were included in the decision-making process. Resource-dependent people are reliant on primary resources for their daily survival. A fisherman said to me, "The amount of money a man has in his pocket will change the way he fishes." If the man he was speaking about has to catch a fish to feed his family that night, it's likely that the risk of a fine or the reward of fishing outweighs the risk of a fine. So I asked 4 questions. The first, is there a difference in satisfaction and resource dependency between fishing communities? Do satisfaction and resource dependency influence perceived compliance? Is there a relationship between actual and perceived compliance as a proxy? Can compliance be described by physical factors such as enforcement, the size of the MPA, or the age of the MPA? So now we'll discuss my methods. I looked at 3 different sample sites. Key Cocker Marine Reserve is the oldest and the smallest marine reserve in this study. Turnip Atoll is the largest and oldest. Southwater Key is slightly smaller and slightly younger than Turnip Atoll. So here's how I calculated some of the important metrics for my analysis. Enforcement is the hours of patrol per square kilometer per year. And actual compliance was determined as the average number of people charged per year per MPA within the estimated fishing population. So to determine the influence of social drivers on perceived compliance, I developed a survey that was adapted from multiple sources of literature, but modified to the local context. I asked 15 questions, with 4 questions in each social driver category. Perceived compliance had an additional component made up of admitted or accused non-compliance, which is why it only contains 3 questions. My survey was formatted mostly as Likert scale questions, with 1 being strongly agree and 5 being strongly disagree. To follow the principles of perceived compliance, I used so where a person's perception of other people's activities reflects on their own behavior. To do this, I used an anonymous indirect questioning technique. And I had to use different sampling methodologies within each marine reserve. So in Key Cocker, I stood out front of the National Fishing Cooperative. In Turniff Atoll, I went on patrol with the rangers. And in Southwater Key, I used a snowball sampling methodology where I asked fishermen to introduce me to other fishermen. So this demonstrates how I grouped each social component of the survey. Each question has a maximum score of 5, which is strong agreement, and each section has a maximum value of 20. Higher composite scores denote higher perceived compliance and higher resource dependency, and higher dissatisfaction. So my questions were oriented in a positive way, which means that it had to be represented as dissatisfaction to reduce confusion in interpretation. So not all of my questions could be asked in a Likert format. So I had to bin multiple choice, binary, and short answer questions based on literature and the overall weight of the concept. So I collected 62 interviews from all 3 MPAs. My sampling was not necessarily as even between MPAs, but it was relatively even between communities. And I found that northern fishers are the least satisfied group across all marine reserves. And these feelings of dissatisfaction could stem from their relatively low social mobility and political inclusion. However, there was a significant amount of contention between fishing communities within the MPAs. First, several camp fishermen were granted access to fishing in no-take zones from their traditional rights to those areas. And these camp fishermen reported that they enforced their fishing grounds better than enforcement officers. So this gives some evidence to the fact that rights-based fisheries management can increase satisfaction when fishers generate their own regulations and can provide an explanation why camp fishermen are the most satisfied category. However, when the areas occupied by camp fishermen are combined with no-take zones, northern fishermen reported that they have very few areas left to fish in. And skiff fishermen, since they're mostly fishing for finfish, they reported less issues with regulations, but more issues concerning the zonation of marine reserves. So in terms of resource dependency, we once again found that northern fishermen are the most resource-dependent demographic. And this likely stems from their high levels of occupational attachment due to the cultural influence of fishing on their communities. Occupational attachment is an indicator of resource dependency, but this also decreases alternative livelihood options and decreases their ability to absorb the costs of change. So camp fishers generally have the highest income of any community. Because they invest a lot of money into their gear and territory, they have a large financial attachment to the industry, which can also translate as resource dependency. And many other skiff fishermen have alternative sources of income. They were the most likely group to report that. So in 2011, Dr. Joshua Sinner assessed social ecological traps in coral reef fisheries with resource dependency as a dominant theme. And he found that poorer fishers were less likely to exit a declining fishery. Within my study, over half of the fishermen stated that their catch had decreased since they started fishing. But still, 30% of northern fishermen hope or expected their children to become fishers, despite the decline in fisheries. So within all marine reserves, there's a visual trend between high resource dependency, slightly lowered levels of dissatisfaction, and low levels of perceived compliance, with the least difference in Ecological Marine Reserve. This could be attributed to the high amounts of community involvement within the MPA, because this was developed by the fishing community and to secure tourism. It's also much older, so people have become accustomed to regulations. But there was no correlation between resource dependency or satisfaction in terms of perceived compliance. Perceived and actual compliance demonstrate a somewhat inverted relationship. So first, let's look at Southwater Key, which has low perceived compliance, but high actual compliance. Low perceived compliance in Southwater Key could be attributed to the high frequency of admitted and accused compliance within my survey. There was a sense of proud lawlessness around fishing in this MPA. And enforcement officers who may have technically been on patrol may have not been meaningfully enforcing regulations, which is why maybe we can see high amounts of actual compliance. However, in Turnip Atoll, fishers seem to have a very positive relationship with enforcement officers, and the enforcement officers seem to be doing quite a good job recording and reporting infractions, which could be why we're seeing this low level of actual compliance. So what we saw on the last slide shows how high quality enforcement, catching more infractions, can show a decrease in recorded actual compliance. However, across multiple years, actual compliance increases with patrol hours. This could be described as a delayed compliance response, when fishers notice people getting caught and adapt their own behavior. So lastly, most fishers have been fishing before the start of all of the MPAs. Acceptance takes time. Fishers become accustomed to no-take zones and see their benefits after a few years. And this phenomenon could speak to the relative perceived success of Ecological Marine Reserve. So this sample was limited by, this study was limited by a number of things, and one of those is the small sample sizes. The study was conducted between the end of conch season and the beginning of lobster season. The proxy of perceived compliance showed some issues when known compliant fishers took the same survey as known non-compliant fishers. They answered the questions very similarly, meaning that the questions maybe should be adjusted in a future study. I also sampled in the presence of park rangers at times, so this could have influenced some social bias. This is a lot to wrap up, but I will try and give a brief conclusion. We need to consider the socioeconomic climate around fishers in MPAs. Fishers are an underutilized tool in fisheries management, and satisfaction can increase voluntary compliance and potentially decrease the cost of enforcement if people are voluntarily complying. But there is still a need for high-quality enforcement, especially in the absence of corruption. Non-compliance is inherently difficult to quantify due to its taboo nature. But if executed correctly, perceived compliance can serve as an adequate proxy. As the next generation of marine scientists, we not only have the opportunity, but perhaps the obligation to foster successful compliance-centric regulations and ensure that users are satisfied to maximize conservation success. Thank you. I'm excited to hear your questions.
Thank you, Taylor. It's time for questions now. I know who would like to start on the jury. Aldine, go ahead.
Hi, Taylor.
Hi, Aldine. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So really nice talk, really clear and pedagogic. So My question is, it's quite general, but how this work can really help you concretely to improve MPA management?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that a lot of the regulations made are grounded in science, but perhaps don't necessarily take into account the situation of the people that they affect. So I'll give you an example. There's a type of gear used by the northern fishermen, which is a hook stick. They hook lobsters out from underneath rocks and pull the lobsters out, but they can't tell the size of the lobster until after they're on the hook, which means that they're breaking regulations. So there is talk of banning that specific type of gear, but that's the most accessible type of gear to these communities. So by creating regulations that accommodate their fishing practices and introducing new alternatives, I think those would be the type of regulations that we should consider.
Okay, thank you. And how many fishermen total do you have in this MPA? And what is the size, the percentage of the respondent you got?
Okay, well, hopefully this will clear things up. So the sample size, or the amount of fishermen in the MPA is an estimate. So this is based off of the active fishermen, not the total registered fishermen, because many people have fishing licenses, but they're not actively fishing. So I got this information from a number of key informant interviews with fisheries officers, fisheries department personnel, and we came up with an estimate for the sample size of each MPA. So we can see that well, I guess it needs a little more explanation than N, but in Turnip Atoll, there were 250 active fishers. Key Cocker had around 190, and Southwater Key was estimated at around 300.
Okay, so I know that for the survey response, you were limited by the time, but did you got a lot of reviews from people, from fishermen, or they were all collaborative?
Almost all of them answered my questions. A lot more than I thought, because I introduced the study as a university project. I'm looking at people's satisfaction, resource dependency in terms of others' perceived compliance. And most people were so excited to give me responses because they really want to see reform in the fisheries. So not only did I get responses for my survey, but I got sometimes hour-long interviews, which decreased my sample size because in an afternoon, I could only talk to 3 fishermen in a couple hour-long conversation. But I got a lot of really in-depth information.
Okay, thank you. And what would be the next step for this work?
Well, I would definitely reframe my proxy for perceived compliance. And I think I would have to put a lot more thought into how I make that anonymous and safe for people to answer, because the way I would reframe it is I would ask people about their personal relationship with other fishermen. Ask, like, does someone close to you often breach fishery regulations? Because literature has stated that that's a much more accurate proxy than estimating the amount of compliance in an area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aldine.
Back to the next.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about your thinking for you, and what is the best solution to improve the satisfaction of the different communities of fishermen?
I actually think it comes a lot down to education. And I think the education would be most helpful coming from fisheries officers. So when I started this study, I thought that resource dependency and satisfaction would be the main drivers of people's compliance. But what I'm kind of realizing now is that it's effective enforcement. And when I watched the enforcement officers in Turnip Atoll, interact with fishermen. They were very friendly, very personable, and if a new regulation was being put in place, they gave them flyers and handouts and told them about the local ecology and why this is important. So I think that's an easy and very direct way to educate people and engage them and ask them their opinion from people who can actually make a difference very easily without having to go out into communities, do a lot of outreach. But I think it's education and enforcement would be really good solutions to focus on.
For you, they need a proof that of the efficiency of the MPA. They need proof to have a compliance about that.
I don't know if I understand your question. Sorry, can I rephrase?
No,
it?
For you, the fishermen need to have some proof of the efficiency of the MPAs to be in this compliance and etc.
You mean like they need to know that no take zones, for example, work? Like they need to see benefits? Is that exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I actually think they do. I think they do see the benefits because a lot of non-compliance happens from fishing in no-take zones. So obviously people know there's more fish there, right? So that's why they're going into no-take zones to fish. So I think they understand the benefit, but they don't understand the consequences.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Et Hubert wants to...
Allez, j'y vais. Thank you for your presentation. If I understood well, there is more or less 3,000 fishermen, and you ask question to more or less 60 fishermen, so it's 2% of the population. So you say in your discussion it's a low amount of people. It's a small sampling. Okay, but in your mind, what is a good? You never ask to everyone. It's impossible. But what will be the good number to have to be confident about the representativity of the study?
Well, I was aiming for around 30% of the fishing population within each MPA. So that's kind of manageable. So it would need to be, for example, this is the ideal sample size. So I'd need to talk to 45 northern fishermen instead of 11, 18, 19 camp fishermen instead of only 2. So it's totally doable, especially if I was doing that in the high season for fishing and had a little bit more time. Because I did have 6 weeks, but I was not able to talk to many fishermen, especially in Turneff, until the very, very end, because nobody was fishing.
Okay. And do you have, I would say that, do you have means to check some information with official data, such as the amount of fish that are caught, or the size of the fish, the average size of the fish that are caught, just to see how there is a difference between what a fisherman will say and what is in the reality? Because generally, in the limit of these studies are people say what they want or what they believe it's true, but there is generally a gap between what you believe it's true and the true. If the true exists, but there is a gap. Do you have some means to check in some case to measure this gap?
Yes. So I did receive catch data and approximations for effort. And I was working with another student who was looking at quantifying this effort in a more meaningful way. We were working side by side in the same marine reserve. So I did have catch data, and I was hoping that I put this in my appendix, but I didn't, because I got really interesting results. I should have presented this. I just had too many results. But so I'll give you another cool example. So people told me that they had seen their catch increase, decrease, or stay the same. And I was curious about why people had said it stayed the same. So I referenced the catch data. And people had told me they saw fluctuations, but it mostly stayed the same. And exactly what they said was modeled in the fisheries data, showing a spike, a decline, but an overall steady downward trend. So people were saying what they perceived just without the ecological context. So I was able to check that that statement from the fishermen against the actual data that we have.
Okay.
But I would say the quality of a lot of the data is lacking in some marine reserves. It was not equal for all marine reserves.
And maybe a last question: do you have tried to compare your results with the results, the more or less same studies, but in other protected area to see if there is the same logical in other kind of population, or it's really dependent of the geography or something like that?
So there are a lot of studies that did something similar, and I adapted their methods pretty similarly, and I got results that I expected, but aside from perceived compliance as a proxy. And I felt like I used very similar questions, not the exact same, of course, but I was surprised to see that perceived compliance might have not been effective. And I actually think I cultivated too much trust, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to seem trustworthy. I wanted people to tell me everything that I wanted to know. But they trusted me so much that they all answered questions about perceived compliance in a way that I didn't expect. So they answered, how much illegal fishing do you think occurs here? And if people were to say a lot, I had assumed that that would translate to they also partake in illegal fishing. But I knew a lot of these individuals had never committed a crime because I had the actual data. Oh, that's probably what you were asking a second ago. I did have some data on turnef fishers if they had ever committed an infraction. So I was able to check if they were non-compliant or compliant, like if they had ever been caught. So I was able to see how some people would answer those questions and how other people, but how I knew how non-compliant people would answer the questions, and they answered it the same way. So I'm not sure what happened in my study, but other studies used the same methodology and it worked out great for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's go for Ella.
So thanks for the presentation and all the energy that you put. So it was really nice. I have a question about if you would have the possibility to start again from the beginning. Would you change something? Would you change some questions?
Yes, I would change a lot of things. I'm trying to remember specifically which questions didn't work, and most of them were related to perceived compliance. I think I would ask more. I don't want to use the word invasive, but I think I would ask maybe more directly to get better answers, because people were answering my questions no problem and telling me more than what I asked. So I think I could get more information if I wasn't so indirect.
Okay. And just a curiosity, do you have an idea of the most common infractions that are committed? And I don't know if there is some that are can be easily addressed and there are not easy solution, but something that can be done against this infraction.
That's a good question. Well, mostly people are taking undersized product, and I don't want to jump to conclusions because this isn't something I investigated, but I think undersized product might be what's most available. So maybe I don't want to suggest a seasonal, like a fisheries closure for multiple years, because that is maybe not the best solution to accommodate people's livelihoods. But it does, from looking at the trends, it looks like the fisheries are declining and maybe they're not particularly well assessed. And so undersized product is the main issue. Fishing in no-take zones is also, let me look. Prohibited zone, 15%. So fishing in no-take zones can, with technology, it's really great because no-take zones aren't very big. So if you have radar, you can tell which boats are coming into the area, or you can tell if boats are coming into the area. And that makes it a lot more efficient for some investment, but overall it's much more beneficial than having patrol officers out there all the time, 24 hours a day, because a lot of fishing happens at night. So maybe investing in technology would be a good enforcement method for that. Yeah, there are some other issues related to undersized product that I think are really interesting, but also a little crime related that I maybe shouldn't discuss on a live stream. But if you want to talk about it, it's really interesting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. Do you have another question you would like to ask Taylor? One of you.
I love the questions. If you want to ask me.
So another one. Okay. Because you love the question.
It's really fun to answer.
How the dynamic of the management of the MPA is transmitted to the fishermen? How do you give them information about the law changing and so on? So.
From my understanding, it's mostly word of mouth, Facebook groups, and the odd informational flyer. So there are new lobster season regulations happening, and it just changed this year. And when I spoke to fishermen, they said, "Oh, lobster season's happening in a couple weeks," and we were saying, like, "Are you sure? When does lobster season start?" So some of them had not gotten the memo, and some of them had not. Some of them don't understand what a marine reserve is, because I was saying in this marine reserve, and they said, "Oh, we don't fish in the marine reserve, but the zones of the marine reserve have general use and no take zones. So they might be in the marine reserve, but not in the no take zone." And people didn't understand the difference. So I think education around that would be a little beneficial.
Yeah, no campaign. I mean, our plan to inform each year all the fishermen, or a booklet or something, just for them to keep and yeah.
And some of the marine reserves, like Turnip Atoll, does a really good job with their educational outreach. So they send park rangers into the communities, especially the northern communities, where they get direct information from the park rangers about the new fishing season, which is great. I think that's what we should see more of.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe we have a question here with the students. Emma, you have one? Then Maryann. Emma?
Yes, I would like to know if you investigated other subjects with them. For example, are they worried about future environmental changes? Do they know what is climate change? Do they know that their livelihoods are subjected to this type of threats, this kind of thing? Have you investigated questions?
That's something I wanted to ask. And I wish I did, because I think it would have given me a lot of good insight into what kind of education is required. So the other student that I was working in Turnip Atoll with, he asked me if he could add questions onto my survey, and that was one of them. And I said, "No, get out of here. This is my survey." And interesting to know what people know. But some people did actually just tell me because I was sitting down for hours having conversations with people, and we ended up talking about ecosystem connectivity and talking about how coastal development was ruining the nursery grounds and the mangroves for the fish that they survive off of. So people do have a lot of ecological context, and they explain it from the perspective of a fisherman, which is much more, it's very interesting when I say, like, oh, MPA spillover, of course. And they're like, what?
Thank you, Taylor. Maybe we can take a last question, Maryann.
Yes.
And short answer, Taylor, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
I saw that you had a problem with starfish, but how did you manage it? And what happened with the starfish?
Is there a problem with the starfish?
I think it's the project she's doing now.
You're talking, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there's a mix-up between projects, I think.
Yeah, the different project, but I will talk to
Okay.
you all about the starfish later.
Okay. So Taylor, thanks a lot for your presentation and for the answer to the questions. We've got some congratulations here, for example, from Florence. Say well done. So congratulations, yes, you can applaud. And so I hope we see you soon, maybe on Thursday for the year one video pitch. See you soon, Taylor.
You on Thursday?
No, okay. Just watching, Taylor, just watching. It's over. You're free.
All right, I'm gonna leave now. Goodbye, everybody. It's nice
Bye,
to see you
Taylor.
on the screens.
Okay, so first we're going to take a short break of something like 3 minutes. We're coming back in 3 minutes with Maryann.
Market in terms of value, as well as in terms of percentage contribution. So in order to do this, I estimated that 93% of all octopus was annually exported. And I created a hindcast of the average selling price using average inflation values from the sole data point available, and that is the 2020 data. This was then compared to the National Fisheries Export Market valuation for the 3 years available, that is 2006, 18, and 19. Unfortunately, due to the lack of hard data in this process, I had to make use of some assumptions and predictions, and therefore is a limitation of this process. Now, coming back to our fisheries, the first thing I did was look at the catch per unit effort trend. And as you can see, initially at the start, it actually reduces, fluctuates a little bit, and then comes back to its starting position and starts gradually declining since then. And a reducing catch per unit effort usually corresponds to reducing abundance, which is not a good sign in a fisheries. However, this itself is not enough to assess the sustainability of any fisheries, and so I came to the results of my model. So this is a multivariate log normal distribution of R, which is the population growth, and K, which is the carrying capacity, based on the RK selection theory, that to estimate the carrying capacity. And based on the value R that was fed into the model, it estimated that the carrying capacity of this fisheries was 790,000 kilograms. Using the estimation of carrying capacity, BMSY was calculated, and estimated stock was plotted against it. As you can see, in the initial years, the estimated stock was actually under BMSY, indicating that it was unsustainable and below sustainable levels. However, in 3 years, this improved, and we see an improvement here until 2018, where again it falls below BMSY, indicating that it's come below unsustainable levels once again. This is because of the exploitation, which, as you see here, is below FMSY, indicating that it's actually within the scope of sustainability. However, it crosses FMSY in 2015 and continues to remain at unsustainable levels until 2020, where it comes back to the sustainable levels. It's also interesting to see how unsustainable fishing in 2015 caused the stock to fall in 2018, indicating the delayed response between fishing pressure and stock. Simply put, fishing pressure was considered excessive of MSY, which was calculated with the use of BMSY and FMSY, at 70,200 kilograms per annum. However, I want to know more about how this fisheries responded from exploitation on a regular basis. And so here we come to the Kobe plot, where the timeline of exploitation is placed, is drawn out against BMSY and FMSY. So the square here is the initial year 2004, which shows how the stock moved from a recovering stock with reduced fishing to a healthy stock because of sustainable fishing. However, in 2015, it crosses FMSY due to excessive fishing. And finally, the stock response crosses BMSY, indicating that the stock has also is now considered overfished. However, there is indication that perhaps with reduced fishing, this might recover if the reduced fishing continues. Also, please keep in mind that the avocado shape over here are the various confidence limits. Coming back to our export market, in order to, so as you can see, this is the Velondriake LMMA Octopus contribution to the national export market. And as you can see, it's very similar to the pattern of annual catch. This is because I've estimated a constant 93% export rate, so that's why it follows a similar pattern. However, it is important to note that from 2006, where $45,000 US was estimated to be provided to the export market, to 162 million export, to a 162 million national fisheries export market, to 2019, where $631,000 was received as export, to 151 million US market itself is indicative of quite a considerable increase. Moreover, if you look at the percentage contribution, it increased from 0.02 to 0.5 and 4 from 2006 to 2018 and 19, which is almost a 20 times increase. This is also a great testimony to show how effective fisheries management can also be beneficial to an economy. However, there are various assumptions that I made which must be kept in mind. For example, I use a Bayesian model which depends on certain priors that I fed. And the prior that I fed, which was the estimated abundance, was not based on a testimony of someone who had any first-hand knowledge of the fisheries, and therefore there could be discrepancies from reality. Secondly, the LMMA has expanded over time due to increased village participation, and so it's difficult to differentiate between increase of octopus catch due to a more productive or more efficient fisheries just versus more area coming under the purview of the LMMA. Also, some data collectors did not collect data on unsuccessful trips initially, and this no doubt affects the catch per unit effort pattern that we saw. And finally, for my export market calculation, due to the lack of primary data, I made use of assumptions and predictions, which leads to a high degree of uncertainty. There are also various external factors that could have affected the pattern of the fisheries apart from actual fishing. One of them is the fact that this region experiences annual climate change related warmings. However, it also received mass bleaching in 2010 and 16. However, this region has been known to be particularly resistant to mass bleaching. So it's likely that it did not affect the fisheries too much, but it's definitely something that should be kept in mind. And finally, in 2020, they experienced COVID-19 like the rest of us. And in order to mitigate the spread, they often attempted to fish less. And there was generally less exports, and so there was also less demand. And this definitely contributed to the reduction of catch that we see in 2020. There are also various limitations in the concept of MSY itself, which are very important to consider. For example, MSY does not discriminate between various sexes of a population, male, female. It does not discriminate between immature juveniles to mature adults. It does not consider the natural seasonal fluctuations in any ecological system, for example, particularly low stock recruitment in a certain year. It does not consider any interspecific dynamic relationships and only looks at one species at a time. And finally, The authors of the model themselves noted that true MSY for various of the stocks that they analyzed actually lay at a more conservative point than the theoretical MSY itself. Where theoretically MSY lay here, but actually at a more conservative point. This is what they noticed for most fisheries, with no ecological justification, by the way. Finally, I used a model, and as we know, all models are wrong, but some are useful, and no doubt this model itself has its limitations. For example, it doesn't discriminate between the carrying capacity of various of the same species in different temperatures, and all of the calculations that it made are made with some level of error. And finally, MSY as a tool is extremely useful, but should be used with extreme caution and should be used by fisheries managers as a maximum limit and not as a target. In conclusion, there is indication that this fisheries recovered from overfishing with the establishment of the LMMA. There is indication that after the establishment of the LMMA, the stock was once again exploited heavily and the stock moved to unsustainable levels, but could possibly recover with continuous reduced fishing. The MSY was calculated at 70,200 kilograms per annum as a limit. Overall, this LMMA has been successful and has led to an increase in catch as well as export, which has increased by 20 times between 2006 to 2019. Finally, I truly believe that this report will be very beneficial to the LMA managers to better understand effective management and improve their fisheries, but this can be further improved with better first-hand information. Thank you. I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Natalie Hilmy, Dr. Reina Froze, and the whole MARRES administrative team for all their help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryann, for your presentation and for staying on time.
Okay.
So I open the floor for questions. Be my guests, my dear colleagues.
Thank you.
I will finish.
I don't know. Thanks for the presentation. So I wanted to ask if there are similar studies on the octopus in other area or something that you can compare with your results. So there are. So this LMMA is very heavily studied because they do have a lot of data, but they haven't looked at the sustainability. It's more like the success of the LMMA that they've noted because more villagers have wanted to participate because they've seen how the octopus population has recovered. But I haven't seen too many studies of octopus in other regions with similar conditions. And by similar conditions, I mean, although this area has a lot of data on catch, it doesn't have a lot of data on carrying capacity, on abundance, on things like that. It really is nothing, which is why I also selected the model that I selected. So in a way, it's pretty unique. But yes, there are other octopus studies, but it's not similar. Okay, thank you.
Continue. Continue.
Yeah, so next, thanks for this nice talk. So regarding the data you use about the abundance of the octopus, and so how did they collect the data along all these different years? Yeah.
The catch of abundance.
It's only looking at the catch?
It's only looking at the data that I have.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
coming back.
Sorry. So this data. Yeah. Okay. This data. This is catch data. It's not abundance. Because for abundance, they would have to do transacts with some sort of surveying method. This is only catch data that they collected at various fish landing sites. So they collected the data on number of octopus caught, the weight of the octopus, how many fisher people were responsible for the catch, and basically that's
so then how can you say that the zone is, I mean, the fishery is sustainable, and how do you know that the reserve it's a success? If you don't have the translate regarding the endemic octopus population.
So that's a very good question, which is why this model was used. So as I said, it's a Bayesian model, which uses prior information that's fed. So I fed one BK range, which is the estimated abundance. So these are a description of the fisheries where ideally someone who has some experience with the fisheries will have to read and say, okay, do I believe that my fisheries is strongly overfished? Is it overfished? Is it fully exploited? Is it underdeveloped? Can I fish more? And someone who understands the fisheries and knows what it's truly like can answer these questions. And then based on that, these value ranges are created. And I fed the BK ranges for the state of the fisheries in the initial year 2004 and 2020 as very low and low based on an interview with someone from Blue Ventures. However, I admit it's a limitation that this person that I spoke to is not someone familiar with the Madagascar fisheries. I would have preferred to speak to someone directly, but that wasn't possible, unfortunately. And I've mentioned that as a limitation. But this is how the model used data based on my information to sort of guide the model to say, okay, this is the state, and based on that, we have to see the catch.
So do you have any information about the dynamic of the number of fishermen that catch these octopus along all these time frames?
Unfortunately, that's not data that I have. I do have the data for how many fishermen were responsible for maybe one catch response. So let's say 100 octopus were caught. And perhaps 5 fishermen were responsible for 100 octopus. And the next day, 10 fishermen were responsible. I don't know if it's the same 5 which are involved.
Yeah, but I mean, if just to know if during all these different years, the number of fishermen catching octopus just increase, or if it's just the experience of the same fishermen that increase, and then at one point, I mean, they are not here anymore, and then nobody's replacing them. So
No,
in the
but-
job of, I mean, do you have such data?
No, I don't have that data, because if I did look at all the fisher people who were responsible, I would get a value, but I wouldn't know the repetitions, and also there were a lot of incomplete data points, so that wasn't, even if I had done that analysis, it would have been incorrect because of the lack of data in several areas, because it wasn't a perfect analysis. But I do know that there is an increase in effort because the LMMA has expanded since 2004, which means more villages are participating, which means more fishermen are
But
participating.
did you try to correlate with your current data the dynamic of the expansion of the LMMA and the octopus?
So I want to do that. However, in order to scale it, basically, I would have to know where the octopus was either caught or where the fish landing site data was taken from. In order to do that, well, there's no information on which reef it was caught from. And although there is information on which landing site, it was incomplete. But even if I ignored the incompleteness of this data, I personally don't think it would have been a good analysis, because in my experience with dealing with people from the fishing community, even if they collect data, even if they collect something very far away in a certain reef, they usually come back to the fish landing site, not that's closest to the reef, but that's closest to their village. So it wouldn't have been accurate, and it would have been difficult to scale it down.
Well, you will. It just depends on the resolution you want, of course. But I think it would be interesting to know if the size of the dynamic of the size of the reserve is correlating also with the catch of the octopus. It's just different resolution, but it's still data, and it can be interesting for such studies.
No, I definitely agree with you, but unfortunately, a lot of the data was there for some data columns and not for others. So it would have been a little difficult to make this analysis.
So for me, I have some questions about the environmental point of view. We don't know the species of octopus.
Octopus idea.
Okay, and what is this place on the food web? The place of this species?
Well, they are predators like every other octopus, and they are. I don't know where exactly it is in the food web, but they are predated upon by larger predators, and they do predate on other smaller fish and other such things. I'm not too sure where exactly it is, but it's definitely somewhere in the middle.
Okay, and let's lead to another question about the consequences of this huge decrease of maybe a decrease of the population. So the consequences on the coastal ecosystems.
I know that the consequences that has been studied so far are mostly the consequences on the local community, not on the local ecosystem. I don't believe, even when the LMMA was created, there was no concern from an ecological point of view that the overfishing of octopus would lead to exploitation of the whole fisheries. No such link has been made in any of the data or any of the literature that I've seen. It was mostly a concern that this would be a huge loss of income to the local communities, not more on how it will affect the rest of the fisheries.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to take into account the ecological point of view to create a link.
Of course.
Yeah, between the fishermen and then any other catch, etc.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting because octopus is not something that was traditionally caught in this region. In fact, it was considered like a poor man's food in Madagascar. Only the fishing community ate it. It's only when the export demand really started around the world, especially from Europe, that's when suddenly everybody realized how lucrative octopus is. And so even historically, there hasn't been too much exploitation of octopus in the region. So it's actually quite new. So yeah, that's something.
So they don't know
No.
what are the consequences of this overfishing, etc.
Yeah. But of course, it's not just excess demand, it's also the reefs are getting destroyed, and that not only affects octopus, that affects the whole fisheries. And that's because of industrial fishing.
Yes, because maybe if there are just too few octopus, they can catch another fish who increase because of the decrease of the octopus.
True. It's definitely a predator. But I don't know there hasn't been any research done on the role of octopus as a predator in this fisheries. And unfortunately, I don't have any first-hand knowledge of this fisheries either. So unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that.
Okay.
But it would be a very interesting.
It's a strategy to change the catch.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Maryann. I have a couple of questions. Okay. I'm coming back on something that you already discussed a little bit, maybe to try to get more details. I would like to know a little bit more how the fishing effort changed. So you spoke about numbers. So the FMSY has been exceeded in 2015, which led to the decrease of the population. But so we are talking about an increase in the fishing efforts. What happened more exactly? Do you have any idea? In practice, you already considered that just before. But once again, are we talking about more effort with the same local community, or an expanding of the local community, or people coming from other communities in the area?
So there was
Yeah.
You can stay here. So there was, in fact, over here, this small increase that you see in just the first year. What I read is that when they opened up the LMMA, people from all around other villages that were not participating got involved. And that's why you actually see this reducing CPUE. It's not because of anything else except that villages who were not participating, who did not sacrifice and seasonal closures of the reefs got involved. And so they then established ways to make sure that this was not happening. It was only the participating villages. But as other villages saw that this was a successful thing, more villagers started participating. And so as a result, although initially there was an increase from surrounding areas, as it expanded, more people got involved, so the surrounding areas became the LMMA. So that itself was why the LMMA expanded.
Okay, it connects to another question, which is more about communication.
Okay.
So we're talking about, we're talking about seasonal closure.
Yes.
How are you communicating on these seasonal closures with the fishermen? In other words, what's the communication from the management to the community, to the fishermen?
So what's interesting is this is not an MPA where the management makes decisions and the fishermen follow the rules. The fishermen and the management come together, they have a council, and they decide how many months each reef or each area will be closed. It's a decision made by the fishermen. And what I have read, based on my reading, I've noticed is that the way they punish certain fishermen for not following the rules is by penalty, and it's usually confiscate like a goat or one of his livestock or something that's of value to the fisher person. But this is not a management decision. This is what the fishermen themselves decided. They said, if one of us break the rules, we will confiscate one of your property or livestock or something along those lines.
Interesting.
So it's really a fisherman's collective, which is why it's called a locally managed marine area.
Fish versus goats. Okay, I'm gonna have a last question, which is a bit on numbers. But so we're in Madagascar. What's do you have an idea of the GDP contribution of fisheries in general, more octopus?
I don't know the GDP contribution of I don't know the percentage, but I do know that it is worth $750 million. But octopus is actually a very small percentage in terms of market share. It comprises of very little. It's less than 5%. There's no data on how much of the 5% comprise of octopus, but it's less than 5%, which is why it's really interesting that in 2018 it was considered the 7th highest export product by the FAO, which is a tremendous achievement for such a small species when you're comparing it to other high-value export products like tuna, which are larger, heavier, and also very high value. So it's actually a very small market share, which managed to come up to such a high level with the establishment of fisheries management.
So you're talking about export. Do you know where it's exported?
Mostly the European Union.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly.
So I'm going more in details. Can you come back on slide 16? We are still talking about percentage. I'm not sure I've got it. So we see here a percentage, so 16.
Yes.
No, it was about these numbers.
Yes.
So here we are looking at numbers. So it was my question was what's the percentage of this number compared to the GDP of the area or Madagascar, but you told me that you don't
No, that wasn't something that I was researching. I wanted to see how it contributed to the market export.
Yeah, okay, I got it. So, allez, let's finish with another one.
Okay.
So here you're talking about octopus, octopuses, octopi, I don't know. Octopi, maybe. So do you have any idea of other dynamics like this one with other targeted species?
In Madagascar.
Yeah.
So I know that tuna is heavily fished, but it's more of an industrial fishing process. It's not small scale. There's also a lot of shrimp farming and shrimp fishing in general. But when it comes to small scale, very local octopus is pretty unique. And unfortunately, Madagascar has sold a lot of its fishing rights to industrial fleets. And so that's where most of the fishing comes from, as in an effort to, well, I suppose, make some, well, when you sell fishing rights, it is lucrative for a country, but in the process, the reefs often get destroyed. And so it's tuna, shrimp, and we have octopus.
As it's really rare, I'm part of the jury, I will just finish with another question.
Okay.
I think I understand that Blue Ventures have done interesting work on changing the types of fish for fishermen, for example, to replace some fish overfished by sea cucumber. Are you aware of any kind of such things in this community to try to compensate?
I know that they're farming sea cucumbers, but octopus is really not consumed locally. It's only the fishermen. And that's
same for sea cucumber.
But the rest is all for export. So although you can try replacing it with another fish, it's not going to replace the export demand because export demand.
Yeah, it's not going on the same. Yes,
exactly.
I guess we are less fan of sea cucumber in Europe.
Yeah.
We'll have to change
the Southeast Asia.
Yes.
And octopus locally, as I said, it's considered a poor man's food. And so people in Madagascar don't really eat octopus except for this community, for the fishing community, based on my research.
Okay.
So.
Another question, guys? No, I guess I see that we have questions in the back. I'm just checking if we have no more questions here.
I'm checking. So I have one question regarding the methodology you use. So, well, when was it developed and for which kind of fish?
So this methodology was developed I'm not sure when it was developed, but it was published in 2021. And it's still, when I say published, it means it's available in 2021, but it's still awaiting peer review. So it's not yet published in journals yet. But this is from a team of researchers led by Dr. Rainer Frose in one of the universities in Germany. And he is a fisheries scientist who's done a lot of previous modeling, including with the father of fisheries modeling with Dr. Daniel Pauly. And so this is one of the models that they've come up with. They have had previous models in the past, but this was considered superior, A, for its better accuracy, its ability to estimate abundance, because this one is a Bayesian model. It's also, it's improved its method in estimating the carrying capacity, because I'm afraid I didn't explain this a lot, but they created a multivariate log normal distribution, which helps, sorry. I have a lot of animations, I apologize.
But can you just apply it to any kind of fishery, or do you have any limit of the model itself?
So this model was noted to be particularly, based on his paper that I read, it's noted to be not so accurate at estimating fisheries that are completely depleted. It's not great in this analysis. However, it was trained by several stock, including larger pelagic stock as well as more local coastal stock, vertebrates, invertebrates. So it's quite varied in terms of the way this model was trained, the way the artificial neural network was trained. But they did say, I think it was 83% it was accurate in terms of within the 95% confidence limit. But the ones that were inaccurate were mostly those that were already heavily depleted, and that's where the calculations tended to go wrong.
Okay, thanks.
I think Charlie has a question.
You mentioned they don't catch non-mature nuclear.
Yes.
Do you know what is the percentage for the non-mature? And if they're like changing for the recovery of the species, are they limiting this type of non-mature into the future?
That's actually a good question. So there is a national rule saying that you can't catch octopus, which is smaller than 350 grams. But even when I looked at the data itself, I noticed that there were several catches which are less than 350 grams. And the reason why they say that there's no point, sometimes there's no point in following the rules, because once they damage an octopus and they realize it's overweight, it's underweight, there's no point in putting it back into the ocean. They feel it's because that octopus is already damaged, it's going to die, it's not going to survive, so they usually bring it on board. So that's also one thing that MSY doesn't consider. When it gives you like a weight limit, it's not considering all these underweight octopuses that are also being killed. Another thing is, as you said, the sex difference. So in a lot of octopus fisheries, not this one, they usually also find it difficult to survive, because usually females are preferred because they tend to be larger. However, this fishery does not rely on traps. Usually traps is what get the females. They rely more on spear fishing, and the females usually go very, very deep in order to spawn, and so they're usually in a way protected from fishing, and that's actually a beneficial thing to this fisheries. However, in terms of percentage, what often is the case when they record data, they collect data. So for 10 octopus, you have 10 octopus weights cumulatively put there. Oh. So I don't know if 9 of them are underweight and 1 is fine, or 5 of them are underweight and 5 are fine, or all of them are underweight. So unfortunately, I don't have a value. That's not data that they have collected. I would have agreed that would have been interesting to know. But even when they recorded just 1 octopus, I did see several octopus that were underweight. Any further questions?
No questions from the background jury.
Okay.
So I think that we're good here. Yes. Again, I can see that. Yeah.
So,
That's all right.
that's an extreme curiosity question. So, thing is that you mentioned that the model you are using, it's the limit is really when the fishery is really going really badly. So, is it a really good model to predict that the stock will? So I mean, what can you do with these data, and which will be the best, maybe a better way to develop something where you can track it.
I agree with that. However, when I said when it's overexploited, I mean it's almost depleted. In my case, in this fisheries, it's not depleted. It's definitely, from my research, it seems that it's definitely gone to it's crossed the sustainability levels. But I don't, even based on the estimations of abundance, Krista. Sorry.
Yes, I'm coming back. It's just sometimes a little bit slow. Yes.
Yes, this is the prior that I fed, where I estimated that it's between depleted and very depleted. And as you see, it's crossed 0.5, indicating that it's unsustainable, but it never crossed 0.25. And 0.25 is dependency levels, where the stock is so low that even if you leave it alone, the population growth is very slow because the stock itself is extremely low. And at this point, even if you sometimes let go and we say, okay, now we're going to allow it to recover, it's unhealthy, it's difficult for them to find mates, there's several things that can go wrong. And it's never crossed dependency levels, which also sort of provides further, not proof, but further resilience to the results, because it's not considered overly depleted. And by overly depleted, I mean crossing dependency levels.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think this time we have a go. So congratulations to you. We've got a congratulations message that's from Ilaria, for example, who is currently also attending the session, but looking at your presentation. Also, I would like to thank Christelle, who has been really, really quick on going to the responsible of the building to stop the working because we had some really bad noise just before. So, merci, Christelle, in the back. Bravo, Christelle. Bravo, Maryann. So it's now time to do a break just before the thunderstorm arrives. Apparently, we are coming back live at 4 with Emma, Julie, and David. We're coming back at 4. Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. So we are in this fourth session on fisheries and environmental economics. And so for the second part of the afternoon, we will be hearing Emma, Julie, and David about, for Emma, the economical cost of ocean pollution impacts on human health in the Med-Sea. We're going to talk mostly about methylmercury. I'm also going to welcome Thierry Picot, because maybe Emma, you can say a few things about your other program.
Yes. So I've been added to the MARRES program this year. I was not part of the program last year because I'm currently enrolled in a school in Paris about biotechnology. It's my studies director that is joining today, just to follow my work too. So I've been in a double degree procedure this year.
So for the double that graduation. So thank you, by the way, Thierry Picot, for accepting to have only one presentation. And so it's for the double degree that you're also here. I will just allow myself to remove you from the screen during the presentation of Emma for not disturbing her. Emma, so we already have your slide here. I would just remind you that you have 15 minutes for presentation. I see that you have a countdown in front of you. And then we'll have 20 minutes of questions from the jury.
Okay.
You can start when you want.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to present you my master thesis that was about the economic cost of ocean pollutants and their impact on human health, and more specifically in the Mediterranean basin. For that, we used the case study of methylmercury. This project was incubated by the LEROPS that joins two different labs, the Ecosys labs and the Scientific Center of Monaco. This work was supervised by Professor Marty Gastaldi and Dr. Nathalie. So to introduce this subject, I would like to tell you that the health of the ocean and the health of humans are generally accepted to be very well linked by the scientific literature. And one of the reasons for that is that seafood provides income, livelihoods, and nutrition for a significant part of the world. However, during the last decades, pollution has increased in magnitude and scale, causing very significant health problems. And part of this health problem here on this data, we can see that it causes 1 out of 6 deaths worldwide, according to a very recent study. Part of these health problems are due to chemicals that can contaminate seafood, and then people consuming seafood are exposed to these toxic chemicals. So seafood, yet essential to a nutritious diet, can also cause seafood security concerns. In addition of being a public health concern, seafood security can also be an economic burden because pollution-related diseases can cause a variety of costs. The first costs are what we call direct healthcare costs, that is to say medical expenses, but it can also lead to indirect costs, such as decreased productivity of the human capital of countries or bigger investments in the health system. And lastly, it can lead also to what we call intangible costs, resulting from pain, suffering, family disruption, and so on. All these costs can be estimated thanks to cost-effectiveness analysis. So we've conducted this kind of study in the Mediterranean Sea and tried to answer the question, what are the costs associated with the health impact caused by pollution in this area? To do so, we used the case study of methylmercury. So during the first part of my internship, I followed a project that was initiated by some of my supervisors and other researchers, focusing on ocean pollutants and their impact on human health. So I've screened different pollutants. So what were the health consequences associated with this contamination? And we focused on methylmercury. Based on this type of pollutants, we developed a proof of concept that can, and the idea of developing such a proof of concept is that this methodology that we tried here could be afterwards replicable on other kinds of pollutants. We've chosen this pollutant more specifically because it is a heavy metal of greatest concern in the ocean from a human health perspective. Its human health effects are very well known. It's a potent neurotoxin, and especially for children. It is also extensively studied, so we had a lot of data to build our model. And lastly, a lot of papers showed that it had a lot of significantly high concentration in the Mediterranean Sea, so it was very well adapted to our study. So for our methods, it revolved around what the DALI metric. It's a metric developed by the World Health Organization. DALI means disability adjusted via years. It's a metric combining both mortality and disability due to a specific condition. If we add those two indicators in one metric, it gives an idea of the number of years of life lost in full health. It's a quality of life indicator, if you want. So in this study, we have chosen to use cognitive deficits, that is to say intelligent quotient points loss, as a proxy to evaluate the neurological impact of methylmercury. So we focus only on disability because this kind of disability does not lead to any mortality. So here is the overview of our methodology. If we want to estimate health impact caused by pollution, we have to estimate human exposure to this chemical. Human exposure is the product of seafood contamination and seafood consumption. once we have this human exposure epidemiological type of data, we then translate it into neurodevelopment impairments of children, and then we put it into an economic perspective thanks to cost of illness analysis. We used several resources to conduct this methodology. For the seafood contamination, I conducted a literature review, compiling in a database measurements of methylmercury in Mediterranean fish, in Mediterranean seafood. For consumption, it exists several international consumption databases that provides free access data. For exposure and the translation of exposure data into DALIs, there is a model developed by the World Health Organization, again, combining the two. And lastly, for the cost of illness, previous studies linked cognitive deficits to lost productivity. So that's how we could estimate the cost linked to the health impact of methylmercury. So for my results, I would like to start by contamination. That was the first step of my study. In our database, we had more than 21,000 measurements of methylmercury in fish. This was measured in 364 edible Mediterranean species. The Codex Alimentarius provides seafood sanitary limits. For mercury, it was established as 0.5 microgram of methylmercury per gram of seafood products. In our database, all the measurements are represented here on the scatter plot. Most of them were below the sanitary limit. It was 1/3 of the measurements below the sanitary limit. However, some species, such as mussels, anglerfish, or sharks, could reach extremely high concentration, more than 30, for example. This is due to the fact that methylmercury distribution across the food webs is driven by complex processes. The first one is bioaccumulation, meaning that throughout the life of the individual, the methylmercury levels increase. The second one is biomagnification, showing that methylmercury concentration increases along the food webs. And this is consistent with our observation because mussels are known to be bioaccumulators organisms. Anglerfish are deep sea species that has high level of contact with contaminated sediment at the bottom of the ocean. And sharks are top predators, so very prone to biomagnification. For consumption data, we had two different options. The EFSA data, so the European Food Safety Authority database, or the FAO database. Both have advantages and disadvantages. So here I would like to compare the two before I move on, because the choice was not easy at the beginning of the study. The EFSA, from a methodological perspective, it's the generally accepted type of data because it is conducted at the scale of the individuals, and it's data specifically designed to conduct risk assessment. So it's very accurate and very easy to use for risk assessment. It's based on directory surveys most of the time. However, it's only accessible for European countries. So not all the Mediterranean countries, for example, countries of Middle East or Africa are not covered by this data. So we couldn't use it. So we looked at the FAO too. The FAO provides agricultural supply data. So it's given at the scale of the country, and it provides an idea of the total seafood production available for consumers. But it does not include all the post-harvest losses that can occur at the household level by people consuming seafood or during transportation. So it's less accurate, and it's the least preferred source of data. But it is available for all countries of the world, so for all Mediterranean countries. So we conducted a Pearson correlation test between the two to see to answer the question, is the FAO data well correlated to the EFSA data, to see if we could use it in our study, and it appeared that both were very well correlated. I've done some manipulation on the FAO, but I can talk about it later. So in the study, we used the FAO data. We had two different scenarios. One was the all-subject scenario, where the FAO data was divided by the total population of the country. On the second hand, we have what we call the consumers-only scenario, where we divided total seafood supply by only seafood consumers of the country. So it's more accurate, but it leads to higher consumption levels. For the consumption levels, with the all subject scenario, the first scenario, we see that it's Spain that is the most, that is the country consuming the highest amount of seafood with 44 grams of seafood per day, followed by France, Israel, and Malta. So rather high development country. On the other hand, with consumers only scenario, it's different, very different results. With Greece, Cyprus, Croatia, and Slovenia, that are the most seafood eaters country, with very high results, almost 400 grams per day for Greece, for example. Those different these discrepancies between the two different models reveals some differences in consumption patterns in Mediterranean countries. From what I have understood from these differences is that high human development index countries such as Spain and France that were the highest in the all subject scenario, it is rather countries where a large part of the population eats seafood, but in smaller proportion size and in less variability in the consumption levels. So it's a consumption well distributed across the total population of the countries. However, for lower human development index countries, such as Greece or Cyprus, Malta, Slovenia, the second pool of countries that we found in the consumers only scenario, we can think that it's a smaller part of the population that eats seafood, but this time in higher proportion and with higher variability in the consumption levels. And this can be explained by an analysis of the seafood sectors of the different countries. In very high HDI countries, there are most of the time intensive fishing practices and a lot of processing activities. This can allow a well distribution of the seafood so that a lot of consumers can have access to seafood. However, in low HDI countries, they are more reliant on small-scale fisheries, and therefore it's mostly coastal population that eats, so a small part of the population of the countries, but that eats a lot of seafood on a daily basis. That's what it reveals. So from those two data, we converted both consumption and contamination to estimate human exposure. So for human exposure, if we want to assess the health risk, we have to compare it to what we call the tolerable weekly intake. That is to say, it's a sanitary limit established by authorities, showing that if the exposure is above, it's risky, and so on. Here it was established at 1.3 microgram of methylmercury per kilogram body weight per week. In the consumers only scenario, we see, so the limit is represented by this yellow line here, and we see that for most countries, it is above the level. So it shows that seafood contamination is a real sanitary risk from a human health perspective in some Mediterranean countries. Especially in Croatia and Greece, they both exceed the limit for all seafood categories. So for crustaceans, fish and mollusks. And especially Malta exceeds the level by more than 5 times. So it's a real risk, and it's coherent with what the literature says, that it's mostly coastal families that have the heaviest exposure to methylmercury. Then we translated this epidemiological data into DALYs, the metric I was talking about before. And so here it's the number of DALYs per 1,000 children born. It means that it's the number of years lived with disability created for each 1,000 children born in the country. If we compare, so we found very high numbers. For example, the highest was Slovenia with 270 years of life lost for each 100 children. And this is very high because if we compare this type of data with other studies. For example, this one conducted in the Amazon within a population very highly exposed to methylmercury because they are living near gold mining. We can see that it's higher. So it really confirms that methylmercury represents a real sanitary risk in the Mediterranean. It is also consistent with other types of data. For example, the last UN Global Mercury Assessment showed that Mediterranean population are exposed to greater methylmercury levels than people from other continents. So lastly, this type of data was converted into economic costs in the cost of illness analysis. Here we look at total costs in million US dollars and then in percentage GDP of each country. And we see that it's not the countries that have the heaviest exposure to methylmercury that bear the heaviest cost. It's mostly southern economies. It's mostly Algeria, Egypt, Libya, and Morocco. For example, in Libya, it was 7.7% of the total GDP of the country. And this is due to the fact that its country having lower GDP and higher fertility rates, so it's the countries the most vulnerable to methylmercury exposure. If we aggregate all these costs, methylmercury exposure leads to a cost of $75.4 billion US per year. And if we imagine that this is the GDP of the country, this country will be the 11th richest country of the Mediterranean Sea. So to conclude on this work provides a concept, a proof of concept, estimating the costs of ocean pollution impact on human health in the Mediterranean basin using the case study of methylmercury. It showed that seafood consumers are exposed to concerning level of methylmercury, and especially in countries where a lot of people live in the coast and rely on seafood consumption for food security. We estimated that the cost of this health burden was $75 billion US lost per year. So it's a very accurate tool to orientate public policies towards a greater mitigation strategies of methylmercury exposure, and also to orient it towards more healthcare. So to conclude on this work, I would like to say that this will be followed by a publication, we hope, in a peer-reviewed journal. For the moment, we target the STOTAN, Science of the Total Environment Journal. And also, my supervisor, Marie-Yasmine Boutin, will work on the next MEDEC report. So we aim also to add this perspective in the next MEDEC report. I would like to acknowledge the ELIA ROPS that incubated this project, and also the other researchers that were involved, as well as my supervisor. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hear your question.
Thank you, Ma. So let's go for the questions. Well, Thomas wants to go first.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. You talk about the bioaccumulation, the biomagnification, but what about the cocktail effect, for example? Did you have some data about that in the literature? Or?
Yes, it is difficult to focus on one pollutant, because we know that pollutants between them can have synergic effects or vice versa. So we know that it is something we have to talk about, and especially in the field of pollutants and seafood consumption, because it's a lot of uncertainty. Because even if, for example, when we eat seafood, it also provides health benefits. For example, protection against cardiovascular disease or protection of the nervous system. So it's a lot of factors that can influence the health burden that we've estimated, and cocktail effect is one of them. I think that the perfect situation will be that we include it in further studies if we target specific molecules that we know have effects with methylmercury. For example, I know that selenium can also lower the toxic effect of methylmercury, and it's present in some fish. So the perfect situation will be where we include it, but it was not included in this study.
And did you notice
Yes.
some biases in your study, and how you can take into account in your interpretation of results?
I have a lot of limits because it was a lot of, if I show you again the overview of the methodology, it's a lot of different steps, and at each step we had some estimations, some parts where we were not sure, and at each step it was a bit tricky to do. For example, to translate the epidemiological data into Belize, we used a model converting dietary exposure to methylmercury into hair concentration. Most of the epidemiological data directly have hair samples and measure the methylmercury into the hair of the populations. Here, we wanted to start from seafood consumption, so we used a model translating seafood consumption exposure due to seafood consumption into hair mercury concentrations. And we know that this can lead to a lot of uncertainties because the model is not appropriate for all populations. So this is one example, but we know it's... for example, another bias is that we consider that that population eats mostly seafood from the Mediterranean. But we know that there are a lot of seafood consumed coming from other countries. So this study is what we called a worst case scenario, because a lot of papers showed that the concentration of methylmercury in the Mediterranean was greater than products coming from the Atlantic Oceans and other seas, for example. So we say that this is a worst case example where people were systematically exposed to very high levels of methylmercury through their seafood consumption, but it might be not perfectly appropriate for countries where they import a lot of seafood, for example. So it's a lot of bias.
Thanks.
I guess it's good to be aware of that.
Yes.
Would like to continue, Elena?
Please. Yeah. Okay. So to continue with the so with that, so thanks for your nice presentation. So in your model, so how can you take into account the accumulation? I mean, the accumulation in the human body, because you mentioned that this is the worst case scenario, but are you taking into account that the human body is also accumulating, and then the effect is becoming even worse, and then the cost will increase? So do you integrate that in your?
No, I think that so it is a worst case scenario from the consumption data, but from the epidemiological data where we talk about the health impact, I would say that we missed some health impact because we focused on only one symptom. On the children, more specifically, because it is the health effect where we had a clear exposure dose effects relationship, and we know that methylmercury also in adults might have effects on the cardiovascular system, for example, but the studies are not here to do this type of study. So we know that it has much more effect on the human body, but we couldn't estimate it here because it's not clear defined on the medical literature.
Okay, thanks. And in the country where the exposition to mercury is really high, so do you know the source of mercury in such country compared to the other one? Is it different, or is there specific? Yeah.
I would say that the difference between countries is not linked to seafood contamination, but mostly linked to higher consumption levels.
Okay.
because we had analysis the distribution of methylmercury geographically across the Mediterranean, and it was mostly the same from between the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean. And also we know that methylmercury is firstly emitted in the atmosphere, it travels a lot, and then is deposited and goes into the ocean. So it's not because in one country there is a lot of emission that this country will be more exposed. The methylmercury is very well distributed around the globe, and it's not directly linked to the sources.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yes.
So thanks for the presentation. I have a question related to the data that you collected from the bibliography. The studies were from were research studies, or were just samples taken from the market, maybe to, just to evaluate the level of methylmercury? Do you have an idea from?
Yes, I have an idea. So in the studies I've read, it was mostly samples taken in the Mediterranean. So in the database, I would put the region it was taken from. Sometimes it was from the market, but we've selected but it was in a very small portion of the papers, and we've selected only the fish from the market coming from the Mediterranean Sea, where the origin was really specified.
Yeah, and my other question was about these data were homogeneous for all the Mediterranean Sea, or you have places where you don't have a lot of data?
So I didn't include this part, but I think it's really interesting, and we will put it in the next paper. It was the Italy, Spain, and France had represented more than 80% of the study we found. In Morocco, for example, we found no study. Libya, same. I think that all southern countries were 0.6% of the papers. So it's crazy how it's different between countries, and in some countries we just don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last question is about would be interesting to include algae or something else that you did not include. What do you think would have an impact?
Yes, one of the things I did not include was the selection criteria we used in the literature review. And one of the criteria was its species that can be consumed. So we removed, for example, marine mammals, algae, because algae, I know it can be consumed sometimes, but I think the consumption levels are not high enough to include them. And also it's a very small amount because I'm at the very bottom of the food chain. So it's very small amounts, and we did not consider that it was risky from a human health perspective to include them. But I think it can be interesting if we want to do more from an ecological perspective to see maybe the transfer into the food web. But here it was very focused on human health, and we did not include it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your presentation. I have nevertheless some question. Not sure to have understood them, but you speak about the exposure of methylmercury of people. Is it possible, or is it forecast to cross this exposure level with mercury in the body of people, to say if there is a link between, because maybe you are exposed without being contaminated. So is it possible or done to see this?
Yes. Most of the time, exposure studies are based on direct measurements in the human body because it is more accurate. So most of the literature I've read was based on this type of measurements. And but in our study, we really wanted to start from the environment, so from seafood consumption. And it was consistent with the literature I've seen, because I showed that exposure levels were highest in countries living on the coast, in countries where they have a lot of coasts and a lot of small-scale fisheries. And in the literature, when they measure hair samples, for example, they show that it's mostly fishing families that have the highest measurement. So it's consistent, yes, with the literature. Yeah.
And so is your study permit to propose some way to reduce the exposure? Because with your study,
yes.
The conclusion is in nearly all countries there is overexposure to mercury. So what is the next step,
yes.
And what do you plan?
I think I like this study because it's a tool for policymakers to afterwards implement more strategy to mitigate population's exposure to methylmercury, and we will include some recommendations to orientate this type of decision in the next paper. But I did not include it right now because it's a very difficult question because at the same time, recommendations vary drastically according to if it's environmentally based or human health based.
Yeah.
Because authorities would say, if they consider the human health, okay, you can eat 2 portions of fish per week. But if it's from an environmental perspective, we know that that fish are depleted, and also that it can lead to to health risks. So they would be contradictory and say less than 1 portion per week. So giving recommendations is a bit tricky, and we have to go deeper in this idea.
And from a health point of view for human, for instance, the only way to manage the exposure is to reduce the quantity of fish that you can eat, or is there other option? Because if you don't eat fish, you are not exposed to methylmercury. That is quite. But do we have, or can you propose other things? I don't have any idea.
Personally, I would say that we wouldn't advise for cutting completely seafood consumption. I would say that we can target, for example, fish with lower trophic levels. Okay. For example, because you can eat fish, but that have not that much of mercury, or for example, targeting the source of mercury. Stopping coal burning, for example, that is the principal source of mercury in the Mediterranean. I mean, it's complicated, but it's one of the perspectives we can say. Or, as it was done some decades ago, cutting the usage of some objects using mercury, for example, thermometers or.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Ma. So exceptionally, as I was there at the beginning of your presentation, I can ask also follow-up questions. Just technical, maybe if you can come back on slide 21.
Yes.
This is this one. So here you're talking about the tolerable intake.
Oui.
So this comes from EFSA. So does it mean that it's a target for European countries?
So the EFSA is a target for. I think that it can be applicable for all countries because.
Oh, sorry, I will try to precise my question. Sorry for the little.
Okay.
So this is something. Is it a target, a binding target? Is it something that the European countries have to?
No.
Okay.
So I presented 2 types of limits. The first one was for concentration in seafood. This is mandatory. This is the acceptable limit below which seafood products can be transferred from one country to another in the European Union. But this one is just guidelines, a sanitary guidelines to enable risk assessment bodies to conduct risk assessment.
Okay, I've got another question. You talked about it a little bit, but maybe I can search for some precision. It's slide number 23. So 2 slides ahead. It corresponds to the Belize.
Oui.
Can you, so you talked about a lot of different aspects, and I would like to underline the fact that in your study, you have a long value chain with different aspects covered. So here, maybe for me, is the most unclear part of how you calculate that.
Yes.
Maybe you have expected this type of question.
Yes. It's difficult and it's very tricky. So we discussed this with other researchers, and we might not include this part in the next paper we will publish. But this is based on a model developed by the WHO. We include this part because it's difficult to say, okay, human health impact costs this much. From an ethical perspective, it's difficult to say, I would say. So we included this aspect to include a quality of life perspective and something that can encompass also more intangible costs, because we are talking here about human life and quality of life. So that is the advantage of this model. And okay, if I try to sum up the model, it's we start from. Can I use the?
Yeah, that's right.
So we start from the dietary exposure, and then we convert it into air concentration of mercury. And there is a link that was recently published between air mercury concentration and IQ loss. You see, and air mercury concentration for each 1 microgram per gram, it leads to 0.218 IQ loss points. And this, and then we estimate that the IQ distribution across the population follows a normal law at 100, and then here I think it's plus more 15. And we see, and the disability is from 70. So here, if people end up being here in this part of the normal distribution, they have disability. So we estimate from this number how many people end up being in this category of people.
Because of
the dietary exposure to methylmercury.
And it remains maybe one step at least, which is
Yes.
production and cost.
Yes.
So because in your model, you have something like that, according to the IQ of the people, they have a production efficiency or something weird like that.
Yes, it's kind of weird. It's saying that for each 1 IQ point loss, people decrease their lifetime productivity by 2%. So we have estimates from lifetime productivity of people in each Mediterranean countries, and it decreases by the number of IQ point loss.
Okay. Last point. So you mentioned it as something extraordinary. So maybe I'm coming back. Here you say that it's still here.
Okay.
You say that the Amazonian subsistence features in gold mining is 200 days. And so that in France, with the Mathew, we're at 250. Do you mean that? And do you think that you can say for sure that we are much more exposed in France to a loss of IQ due to fish consumption than close to a gold mine in Amazonia?
Yeah, I think that here we couldn't say that it's the total population of France that would end up being in this category of people. I would say it's only people on the coast or people having very extremely high seafood concentration, but certainly not people in, for example, rural areas or people not consuming that much of seafood.
Okay, so I will let the people recognize themselves. Okay, thank you, Emma. Yes, we're running already at the end of the time. Just to say that you've got a few hello and congratulations from Grateful Florence, who is Nadia, but we're thinking about you, and also, so not only from students, but from bio, if you know this person. It's a really nice presentation. Maybe just to welcome Thierry Picot. I know, Thierry, if you want to say a few words in French or English.
Oui, si vous me le permettez, pour me mettre vraiment en dehors de l'évaluation, quelques mots en français. Alors, il ne faudra pas que ça influence du tout votre évaluation. Elle vous est propre et vous êtes bien plus pertinent sur le sujet que moi. Mais j'ai été très impressionné par tout à la fois le contenu et le travail qui a été présenté par Emma. Donc, ne soyez pas influencés par ce que je vous dis. Hein. C'est un ressenti qui est extérieur à la thématique que je maîtrise beaucoup moins. Et d'ailleurs, la démarche, j'ai vu qu'il y avait une démarche qui est celle de quelqu'un qui arrive en fin de diplôme, hein, c'est-à-dire qu'on contextualise le sujet, on présente l'ensemble des acteurs, puis ensuite on présente les résultats, on les analyse, et puis on se projette vers un avenir par rapport à ces résultats-là. Et puis on met un brin d'économie là-dedans. Moi, j'ai trouvé le travail, il était vraiment complet. Et si je dois aller un peu plus loin, et je suis toujours très content de ça pour les élèves qui sont en fin d'études, et encore plus quand ils sont en double diplôme, c'est que j'ai été très largement dépassé par les analyses. Et je suis très content quand les élèves réussissent à dire « ça y est, maintenant on maîtrise bien plus que vous ». Donc vous voyez, vous avez réussi à faire de nous des gens bien. Voilà, donc bravo Emma pour tout ça. Bravo à vous pour la qualité de vos discussions et des questions, parce que j'ai vu qu'il y avait des questions qui étaient non seulement pertinentes, mais en plus parfois un peu compliquées. Donc, bravo, vous êtes allé au fin fond de l'analyse, c'est très bien pour évaluer les élèves. Et puis, je peux que souhaiter une bonne continuation à Emma. De toute façon, elle nous avait prouvé que toute la pertinence de son parcours et de son niveau, elle ne fait que concrétiser tout cela. Donc, bravo à vous tous et bravo à Emma.
Merci.
We are going to take a couple of minutes break, 2 minutes just to jump to the next speaker, who is not speaking at all, Julie. So coming back in 2 minutes.
Christophe.
Merci, Audrey.
Je te laisse.
Merci à vous.
L'évaluation. Ou, ouais, ok, parce que.
Okay, here we go back. We are ready for the presentation of Julie Marty Gastaldi. We're going to talk about the marine protected areas around here in the South Mediterranean, France. Yeah, ça va changer. You're right. It's important. Let's do that first. And do you have your time with you?
No.
In your head? Okay.
Si je vais
I will remind you. Okay. Let's go. So, yes.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to present you my master thesis I did in the Fisheries Department with Calikanzaros and also in the Ecosystem Laboratory with Dr. Benoît Dereja. I was working on MPAs and small-scale fisheries here in the Mediterranean Sea. And the question is to know how can marine protected areas improve small-scale fisheries catches. So first of all, I will give you some definition. MPAs, or marine protected areas. MPA is a geographic area of the sea clearly defined by laws to improve the long-term conservation of the nature within it. There are various levels of protection in the term MPA. As you can see on this picture, and the highly protected zone, so the fully protected, is the no-take zones, as Taylor already spoke about that today. In this no-take zone, all the extraction activities are prohibited. In some cases, anchoring, boating, or scuba diving are allowed. No-take zone is one of the solutions to reduce the fishing impact and the decline of marine species, because when you create a sanctuary, it enables the nature to be resilient. I was working here in the south of France, in the Alpes-Maritimes and Var department. We have 8 MPAs. In Var department, the biggest one is Cap Roux. And in Alpes-Maritimes, we have Roquebrune, Cap Martin, Cap d'Aille, Beaulieu-sur-Mer, Cagnes-sur-Mer, the smallest one, Pécreux in Antibes, Golfe-Jean, and then Cannes. Cannes, in the south of Saint-Honorat Island, is not an MPA yet. but it will be protected soon. Now I will define the small-scale fishing, as known as artisanal fishing, in the Mediterranean Sea is represented by 1,500 vessels and is more sustainable. Artisanal fishing is more sustainable than industrial fishing. The particularity of this type of fishing is close to the coast with small boats. As you can see on this picture, Arnaud is in front of Beaulieu-sur-Mer and his boat is 9 meters. The fishermen use different fishing gears according to the seasonality and the availability of the species. And artisanal fishing is versatile and highly metaphor specific, meaning the fishermen do not target one fish, but a multiple species in the same time. You have to know that my work was the first step of a long-term project called the Reef project. Is a network to monitor the assemblage of the fish population and the fishing activities in the MPAs in the Var and Calikanzaros department with 3 different complementary approaches. The first one is the UVC, underwater visual census, then the experimental fishing, and the environmental DNA. I did not much participate to the last one because it's a project of one PhD student in the laboratory. But I was part of the underwater visual census. It's we have to go underwater in scuba diving and to count the fish. We did the first campaign between February and April, and we did 22 days at the sea over the 3 months due to the bad weather delay. In the same time, we did a questionnaire to start the experimental fishing beginning of April. So I will more focus on the experimental fishing. The aim of my study is first to evaluate the benefits that an MPAs can bring to the fishing catches, and also to characterize the small-scale fishery in ecological and economic point of view here in the Alpes Maritime. So I developed a survey for that, but I will not have time to develop, and I will more focus on the fishing catches. So this presentation will focus on the experimental fishing in 3 different MPAs in the Alpes Maritime and Var department, Cap Roux, Cap d'Aille, and Lérins. Cap Roux is in the Var department, created in 2003, so close to 20 years of protection, so it's for all MPAs. Then we have Cap d'Aille in Alpes Maritime department in the east part, created in 2020, so with 2 years of protection, new MPA. And then Lérins, so in the south of Saint-Honorat, we will have soon the MPAs, and this MPAs was added to the project because it's interesting to have a control, a baseline before the protection to see and to compare the data we will have with the next years. So the experimental fishing was done with collaboration with the fishermen, and the fisherman has to go inside and outside of the MPAs to put net, and outside it was close to the boundary and far away at 1.5 kilometers. This picture is in Cap d'Aille, this map. And because my analysis will focus on the difference between inside and outside of the MPAs, we just sum up the close and far. So the fisherman has to put a net of 500 meters during 12 hours. The net we used for the experimental fishing was the Trommel net. It's a 3-layer net with the layer outside with the big mesh and the layer inside with the smaller mesh. And we had to define the mesh for each MPAs because it's different to be more representative of what the fishermen use. So we defined that thanks to the survey and the meeting before the experimental fishing. In Capdai, the mesh size is 5 knots, so we can see here 5 it's big, and compared to Lérins where it's 9, so the mesh size is smaller. The big mesh allowed to have biggest fish, and big is 5. So every morning when the fishermen come back to the port, we have to go and let them to take the picture of the fish caught the night before. So we have also to take the picture with the rules and with the code to know exactly where the fish come from, and we have also to fill the fishing sheet. Then, thanks to the book Easy, I had to count the number of fish and to define the species and to put all the data in Excel document to know the abundance, the trophic levels, and the species richness. So now let's move to my results, thanks to this data collection. First, the abundance. Abundance is the number of individuals per MPAs. For example, we have in Capu 20 individuals inside of the MPA. Outside we have less than 10, and the difference between the inside and the outside, it's more than twice. So the difference is significant with a p-value of 0.02. And this was expected due to the long-term protection, close to 20 years. Then in Capdai, we do not have significant difference between the number of individuals inside and outside, but as you can see, inside is higher than outside, and this result can be confirmed by the years go by, because in Capdai it's just 2 years of protection. And then in Lérins, we do not have significant difference between inside and outside, but still it's higher inside. Then for the trophic level, why it's important to look at the trophic level? It's because the fisherman is used to target high trophic level predator because it's an economic interest for them, and we do not have significant difference between inside and outside of each MPAs for the trophic level, but you can see in Capu it's close to 4, in Capdai as well, and then in Lérins it's less, and this is due to the size of the mesh in the net when they caught the fish. Then for the species richness, we do not have difference between the species richness inside and outside of the MPA for Capu. We do not have significant difference in Capdai, but same you can see for both. There are more different fish, species of fish inside than outside, even if the difference is not significant. But in Lérins, we have 20 different species inside of the future MPA, and outside we have 10, and the difference is significant. And this is very surprising because in Lérins we do not have protection yet. So our results show that it's a site effect, and the site is ecological interest, and it's nice to protect it. So to discuss a little bit my result, the age of an MPA is an important factor. We saw with close to 20 years of protection, we have significant difference between inside and outside of the MPAs, but we don't have difference in Capdai and Lérins, where we don't have protection, and then we have just 3 years of protection. But the age, it's not the main factor. We have also to look at the substrate of the MPAs, also the habitat complexity inside MPAs, the size of the MPAs will also affect the level of protection and the control, if you have control of the MPAs or not, and also the fisherman involvement. An important thing to mention is the trophic level was weighted with the number of individuals, and I didn't consider the size of each individual. And this probably limits my result, and it's probably why I don't have difference in the trophic level inside and outside. Because when you look, for example, a grouper, a small grouper of 10, 15 centimeters do not have the same impact in the ecosystem than a group of 1 meter. So the biomass must be considered, and I didn't do it due to the time issue, but the analysis is in process in the Ecological laboratory. And then the fishermen target different type of fishing across the department. This is a conclusion I saw in the fishing catches. For example, in Lérins, it's different than in Cap d'Aille. In Lérins, we have more fish with more different species inside, but with less trophic level. And this is due to the fishermen, which fish they target. I have also this data thanks to the questionnaire we did. In Cap d'Aille, they caught large fish. So you can see on the picture, the size of this word is 50. So all the fish, it's close to 20, 30, or higher than 50 for the grouper. And this is due to the consumer habits. In the east part of the department, the consumer is used to eat this type of fish. Compared to Lérins, where you can see we have really small fish, close to 10, 15 centimeters, because the fishermen used to target this type of fish, like rocky, in shallow area fish, to cook what we call la soupe. It's a very common Mediterranean food culture. So the fisherman is used to cook this type of fish in the west part of the department. It's the same in Golfe-Jean or in Antibes. So to conclude, time is needed to see the effectiveness of the protection, and the literature say that we have to wait 4 or 5 years before we saw any effect of the protection. And time is not the only main factor, substrate is also important. And the target species are driven by the preference of the usual consumer. Fishermen do not rush for the quantity, but for the quality of the fish, or for the fish that they know they can sell after in the market. So to go further, this was the first campaign. So we try, we test, we implement protocol, and we create collaboration with the fishermen. So the first campaign made it possible to initiate collaboration between fishermen, scientists, manager, local elected representative. I learned about science in my internship, but also about human relationship. And if I can conclude on that, if you want to have an efficient MPAs, and the MPAs works, you need to involve all the stakeholders at the beginning of the project. So thank you for your attention.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. So here's time for questions. Who would like to start? Jump. Questions. Elena. Okay.
So thanks for the presentation, and I have a question that is related about all the presentation that have been done before. So even if are a small MPA, are they well accepted by the fishermen, or which is your opinion?
When the MPA is the idea of the fisherman, it works. So, for example, I have the maps on Antibes. The fishermen decided by themselves to create the MPAs because they wanted to protect the area. And sometimes it depends on the reason, but sometimes it's to protect the marine life, or also to not have illegal fishing inside. For example, so La Pesquerolles, because here you have a very nice dive site, and with like a huge rock inside with a lot of fish around. So the fishermen wanted to protect this place, so they decided to create an MPAs here. And it's more complex because it's dependent name, the French name, and statute in the MPAs. But inside the diving and the fishing, it's not allowed. It's the same for Cap d'Aille, for example. So this is created in 2020 and Cap d'Aille as well. And it's also the involvement of the fishermen.
Okay. And they are respected this area, or?
It's not easy because there are a lot of illegal fishing and from the recreational fishing. So, and also from free divers who harpoon and so on. So it's not easy to control because these MPAs do not have efficient control. So they do not have patrouilleur that can go on the MPAs and check. So it's not easy to define if they are illegal fishing or not.
Okay.
But the fishermen and the professional fishermen wanted these MPAs, so they respected.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Hubert?
You say thank you for the presentation. Sorry, you say the age of the MPA is a determining factor to see a big difference, but in your presentation there is on 3 parameters. So you compare abundance, diversity, and trophic level. In fact, there is difference only in abundance. So how can you challenge this? Because okay, probably age is an important parameter, but you talk about other parameters such as the size and. So can you challenge this sentence and this affirmation? Because for me, it's questionable.
I choose 3 different MPAs, so old, new, and future MPAs to see the effect of the age. So it was my first hypothesis, but at the end, yes, I didn't see any difference, and also I think because I didn't consider the biomass. I think if we consider the biomass for the trophic level, but also for the species richness, because the species
just what is for you the biomass? The amount of what is the biomass?
The biomass is the sum of the weight of each fish.
Okay.
So because we have the picture of the fish with the rules, so a software will directly estimate the size of each fish, and with calculation, we will have the weight of each fish. And the sum of all the weight we can have will give us the biomass per net.
Okay.
And this is the CPUE that Taylor is more to talk about. And we can compare this measurement. And it's very famous in the literature. A lot of people use that to compare inside and outside of the MPAs. So to answer to your question, yes, I cannot conclude on the age. But also, yeah, different factors are important.
Or you can conclude, but just you can say it's true just for abundance, but maybe for it, in fact depend of what you're studying. And maybe another question, I'm not sure of your explanation about the size of fish and your story about the soup. Between Cap d'Aille and Maryann, there is 40 kilometers, and the life way of people are probably very, very similar. In Marseille, we eat soup, and in fact, it's generally soup coming from everywhere except from Marseille. But so, are you sure of your explanation? It's a little bit.
It's my result. I did the survey as well, and in the survey, when I asked the question in the east part of the department, it was different than in the west part, and this is due by the humor. I think it's due by the humor consumption, but also by the substrate, because here in the west part, so Lérins. In Antilles as well, we have a lot of substrate with Posidonia and a rocky, shallow area. So the fishermen used to put the net with small mesh size to catch this small fish, like labridé, and small fish to do the soup. And they do not use a lot of time the big mesh. compared to Cadai, in Menton as well, they use more higher mesh because they want to catch beautiful fish, du beau poisson, because they told me it's easier for them to sell this kind of fish. Because in Menton, in Cadai, the fishermen don't go in shallow area, but more in colony.
Okay. But they, what is unclear for me, it's in Antibes they catch small fishes because there is just small fishes, or there are also big fishes, but they don't want to catch it.
It's
the same at
it's because they want to catch this type of fish.
Okay, so there is big fishes, but they don't want.
Yes, and it's also conservation mood, let's say, because in Cadai the fishermen didn't want to catch the small fish to preserve the marine resources. So it's different type of conservation. In Lérins, the fishermen catch very small fish, but they told me during winter they stopped to catch in one place to allow the population to come back and to preserve the marine resources. I didn't present this further because I just have like a meeting and talk with the fishermen, and I didn't check on the réglementation in each prud'homme. But yeah, it's a different type of conservation.
Okay.
And it's very complicated to implement rules if in the same department they do not have the same target fish and the same type of fishing.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, there are some prud'homme, and each one have a different strategy to manage the fish stock. So it's very difficult to have a uniform strategy. Yeah, I want to take a look at the map of the three MPA, Lérins, Cap-Roux, and Cap-d'Aille, and the boundaries. When you want to explain the species richness who are high in Lérins in comparison to the other, you said it's a side effect. A side effect. A side effect.
It's not a protection effect, and it's a side effect.
Okay, and can you explain more precisely why? This is because it's a very interesting result, and why this site, in comparison to the other, there is this side effect. Look at the boundaries and the bathymetric.
Yes. In Cap-d'Aille, you can see the bathymetry, and the fishermen do not fish here because it's too close to the rock, so it's dangerous for their net. So when they fish, it's more here or here, and the depth is close to 30-40 meters. And in Lérins, it's very shallow. The fishermen used to put the net in this area and like that. So it's between 5 and 10 meters maximum.
Okay.
So it's very shallow, rocky bottom.
Okay, for the inside, but for the outside.
For the outside of Lérins,
yes.
It was so close to the end, because we have close and far away from the MPAs.
Okay, close.
To the MPAs, it was at 2 different depths.
Okay.
Here and in the parallel, but more deep. And same, but next to Sainte-Marguerite.
Next to Sainte-Marguerite.
Yes, Sainte-Marguerite, sorry. And also, maybe you will understand why we have this kind of result. In Lérins, here we have a very large white.
Why?
because it was the first campaign, so it was the first collaboration with the fishermen. I asked the fishermen to go to fish in a rocky bottom close to Sainte-Marguerite, and the fishermen put the net not in the good place, and they have very large fish and just 2 or 3 fish. So it's why we have like this kind of data. And we did 10 different. The N is the number of the replicate, so it's the number of nets. And yeah, it's very large and maybe not representative because we try to do the collaboration and sometimes they did the wrong fishing characteristic, like in the wrong place or during a too short time. So it's why we have limited results.
Okay. And did you have some data on the visual census to compare with the catch?
And we finished the campaign in April and we just collect the data now. So we do not have the data. It's not available now. It's not the data is not available.
Did you know the method of underwater visual census?
Yes.
This is just transect, or they are just transect?
Yes, it's transect. Yeah. So I have also to give you the example. So it's this kind of. So we have to go underwater during the scuba diving to follow a transect of 25 meters. And here we have the name of the species and we note the size of each species with the estimate of the numbers. So yeah, it's basically Harmon method where you have to count the fish on different substrates.
Okay, and for you, what is the limit of this kind of visual census?
It's why the Reef project is a complementary method with the underwater visual census and the experimental fishing, because when you are in the sea, under the sea, and you count the fish, of course you are like an entry in the sea, so the fish can go away and you cannot see the fish, the night fish.
Night fish.
Yeah, the night fish. Or
the nocturnal species.
Yeah. And also some species are very, can be confusing with the Posidonia seneca and you go inside so you cannot see them. And also the very shy fish, you cannot count them. So it's why we do also the experimental fishing to have, but the experimental fishing has some limits as well because it's just the fish caught by fishermen, so just the commercial species, and you cannot have all the species in the net, and same in the underwater visual census. And also the particularity of this project is to have the environmental DNA, where you can have kind of all the species in your sample, but it's just the present and the absence. It's not the number.
Okay, and when you combine the results of the UBC and the results of the catch data, what is the effect or the measure in the conclusion at the end of these two methods?
It's the aim of the project, and it's the aim of the PhD student to know if we can see the effect of the protection with UBC or the effect of the protection with the experimental fishing, and to compare which method not is the best, but if they are complementary together.
Yeah. Okay, because you talk about in your description about spillover effects, and you don't speak about that. So.
Yes. So yeah, the spillover effect. I didn't speak about that because it wasn't my objective, because I assumed that I will not give results and talk about spillover, because I was thinking that spillover, it's more, we will have spillover with the UBC because we compare inside, outside close, and outside far away. So if we have more fish outside close to the MPA than outside far away, we can see that we have a spillover effect. But I just compare inside and outside. But yeah, the spillover effect, it's when you have an MPAs and all the fish inside go also outside, and it's an economic interest for the fishermen. I didn't have time during my survey to talk about economic benefits I just talk about the catches, how many catch we can have thanks to the MPAs, but I don't have time to know exactly the price and how much we have and so on.
Okay, no, because I was just curious because on your
This is the abstract.
yeah,
of
the abstract, okay.
paper.
But okay, because the one is assessing the spillover page.
You might- you
I want
might-
to have
you can,
I have some.
you can have a look to the report.
And in my final report, I delete the words below.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I did.
Thank you for this nice presentation. So if I understand well, so you, for each different MPA, for the experimental catch fishing, you use different nets, mesh size.
Yes.
So I understand the comparison between inside and outside a specific marine protected area, but how can you compare the abundance, the trophic level, and the richness in between?
I can compare between.
Okay, but your language is
I try
going
to
in
do that.
this direction, and with the age, I mean, you have to be careful about that. So okay, so if you know that you cannot compare, it's great.
I try to not compare because yes, it's not the mesh size, so it's not comparable between each MPAs. I did the comparison between inside and outside.
Okay.
And I just, when I compare, I explain that this comparison is explained by the mesh size.
Okay. So then when you are performing the experimental fishing, so inside and outside, it's on one specific marine protected area, it's the same date, right? Is it the same day, same fisherman is doing a catch inside and a catch outside?
So it wasn't the same fisherman. It was for the first campaign, we decided to work with some fishermen. For example, in Cabdai, it was the same fisherman, and in Lens, there are 3 different fishermen. One did the fish inside, one did the fish outside close, and one did the fish outside far away.
Same day and same season?
Not the same day, but same season. Like every Wednesday, we went to the market in Lens and we collected data, so the fishermen put the net exactly the same night for the 3 sites.
Okay.
But not everything the same day.
Okay, thanks.
But it's the same season.
Okay, and about the layer inside, I hear that there is some rules regarding the season for fishing. So you say that there is no protection, no protected area around the ends, but there is still rules that stop you in cases here.
Yes.
So,
in
Any comment
Lens,
on that?
officially, we do not have MPAs. It's a Natura 2000 area, but without MPAs or no take zone. So it's why we want to create, they want to create new MPAs. But of course, the fishermen in the predominant they put the south of Florence or the rocky area, they close this area during the winter to allow the species and the small fish to grow.
and,
I don't have exactly the dates.
okay, and you conclude a little bit also, or you state some conclusion using your social data from the survey. How many fishermen you get response from, and on how many fishermen total present on the French Riviera?
In the Reef project, we have 14 fishermen. So yeah, we have 14 fishermen, and I found a document say that there are 80 fishermen in the area.
Okay.
So in the Alpes-Maritimes department, this 14 and this the questionnaire was done just in the Alpes-Maritimes department.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not representative, but it's the fishermen wanted to be involved in a conservation project.
Yeah, but be really careful to the statement you mentioned about the conclusion and the comparison between all this. Yeah.
Especially because you just ask question to people to a specific category of fishermen, which are fishermen involved in MPA. The other that are different moods will have probably a very different answer.
Yes.
And also the fact that you mentioned that some catch more small fish than others. I mean, on the 14, it's hard to conclude that because I'm sure on the 80 or 83, a lot of them on all the coasts will love to catch big fish for their.
And it's the same fishermen that did the experimental fishing.
Okay. And why you never had any observer, a scientific observer on the boat when the fishermen were doing the nets, the experimental fishing? So you never went on board to control the.
We didn't have authorization to go on the boat.
Oh, yeah?
No,
Okay.
because in the project was to do the experimental fishing with fishermen, and because these members just go in each boat to take a picture. They didn't mention to go on the boat, but of course it will be.
Very important for the
very
catch and the site of the catch.
Thank you for the jury, and thank you, Julie. Yeah, congratulations. So we are doing a 2-minute break, so we can conclude on the last presentation. That will be with David Broussard. So we'll come back on the LMMA effectiveness. With Taylor, we're in Belize, and here with David, we are coming back with Belize. In 2 minutes. So we are back, and as you can see, we've got a large support group on our back for the last presentation of today. And so we will welcome, as I said, the last presentation today, if it works. We're going to present, yes, David Broussard, who worked with Nathalie on the Centre Scientifique de Monaco. David, do you have a time countdown?
I have one here.
You have, it's good? Yep. So you have the floor.
Let's go. So welcome to the last presentation of the day. My master thesis that I conducted with the Centre Scientifique de Monaco about the effectiveness of locally managed marine areas. And there, more specifically, I chose a case study on the Velondriake area in Madagascar. So first, let's have a look at what's the difference between locally managed marine areas and MPAs. So most of you probably know what a marine protected area is. So we have a designated area managed for marine protection, more from a bottom-up approach, so led by the government, usually in cooperation with NGOs. A locally managed marine area is quite similar. However, we have more of a bottom-up approach because we include the community that lives there. So it's managed by the community and also co-managed by NGOs and other agencies. Oh, sorry. And other agencies. We have specific laws within this LMMA that are not legally binding, but I will show you that later. So here, one of the largest LMMAs in the Western Indian Ocean is the Velondriake area in the southwest of Madagascar. So the southwest of Madagascar, there we have a lot of coral reefs, we have a lot of lagoons, a lot of mangroves, so a lot of ecosystem services that are very important to protect for the community there. And the community that lives there are the so-called Beso. Beso means people who fish. These are semi-nomadic people that wander around in the southwest of Madagascar in the search for food, because over 90% of them are in fisheries for their own food, basically. The problem there was, so they use very simple techniques with the pirogue boats you see here with the spears. However, this sustainable method also got a bit disrupted by migration from the central parts of Madagascar, because people wanted to participate in this, obviously. They brought more destructive fishing methods, and this led to a fishing crisis with the industrial fisheries, of course. Therefore, in 2006, the NGO Blue Ventures established a locally managed marine area, Velondriake. And there within this LMMA, we have several local laws that I was talking about. These are called DINA in the local language, and DINAs they are not legally binding. However, they try to be enforced by local communities. independently through an elected management committee by more of a learning by doing approach. And Velondriake currently is managed by Blue Ventures, as I said, but obviously also by the community, because that's the main goal, that the community can manage this area completely alone. The question I was looking at is if these locally managed marine areas are an effective way to protect the environment, because that's an important point, while also enhancing the community's well-being. Therefore, obviously, so is there a positive impact on the marine environment? Is there a positive impact on the society? And to answer this, I had a look more on the community's well-being. When we take a look at well-being, I chose 4 important well-being indicators: social, cultural, health, and governance. These are adapted from Kaplan, Hallam, and Bennett, and they define these 4 well-being indicators as the most important ones when you want to have a look at the impact on the well-being for a community in the context of marine conservation or conservation in general. There, for social impact, we had education, gender equality, transfer of cultural knowledge, and Blue Ventures really was able to address especially SDG 5, gender equality, for enhancing the sexual and reproductive health, especially for women in this area. And they could transfer the knowledge, because especially the cultural knowledge, because it's quite important for them to transfer this sustainable fishing methods to other generations. Then regarding health, they address the SDG 3, especially target 3.2, which is about ending all preventable deaths under 5 years of age. And there they could significantly impact infant deaths and reduce them. And for governance, there's the most important for LMMAs is the level of trust, because here we have a study from Ollison et al. From 2015, where they surveyed the basil community within LMMAs. And there they found out that over 90% of the population there is really proud to be from Velondriake, so they have a huge level of trust. So regarding the environmental data, the environmental impact I was looking for was in cooperation with Blue Ventures, as I said, and here I had a look at hard coral recruit colonies and fish belt surveys with fish counts. The study area, you can see here within the Velondriake area in green, we have the reserves. So reserves is basically our no-take zones, nothing is allowed there, nobody can touch anything there. Then we have the controls in red. So these are within the LMMA, however, there's everything allowed, so every sort of fishing method is allowed there, there are no rules. And then the most important is the others, because these are the most common areas within an LMMA. That's where the so-called DINA laws I explained to you apply. So we have different fishing methods are allowed and seasonal closures, for instance. So regarding the hard coral recruits, what they did, Blue Ventures, between 2010 and 2019, they measured the diameter of the colonies and noted them down and classified them into different sizes between 0.5 centimeters and 10 centimeters. And there, more specifically, I had a look at 2 functional groups, the massive corals and the branching corals. Why massive and branching corals are considered to be 2 very important functional groups. Massive corals are, as the name says, they are big, they are boulder-shaped, they're reef-building corals. They're very resistant, however, they grow relatively slowly. And we have the branching corals grow pretty fast, however, they're quite sensitive also to anthropogenic pressure and also coral bleaching, for instance, and heat waves. Then, regarding the fish belt surveys, this was the second environmental indicator I was looking at. They investigated between 2004 and 2020. They had a look at, they measured over 200 different species with fish counts, and I had a look at species diversity and species richness. Besides that, also, when we have a look at the hard coral recruits, I also wanted to have a look, besides massive and branching, on the 2 different reef types, barrier reef and patch reef, Barrier reef, as the name says, creates a barrier between the open ocean and the coastline. And within this lagoon that is created, we have the patch reef, basically. Why this is important, we'll come back later to this. Here we have LMMA means protected sites, control means not protected sites. When we have a look here at first the barrier reef, for the massive corals, we see they have very high mean size values for the protected areas. The same also for the control areas, however, way more fluctuation. For the branching corals, we have a similar pattern, however, also a bit more fluctuation in both. When we check the patch reefs, we have pretty low mean sizes throughout the years from 2010 to 2019 in both protected and control areas for the massive corals. And for the branching corals, we see relatively high sizes, mean sizes throughout the years in the protected areas. And from 2015, we see a clear drop in the mean colony sizes throughout from 2015 until the end 2019 of the measurements. Regarding the fish belt surveys, so I here had a look at species richness, as I said, and species diversity. For the species richness, I chose the Manhinix index because we had unfortunately a problem of different sample sizes, and the Manhinix index is a richness index that is supposed to correct these differences in sample sizes. For species diversity, I chose the Shannon index because it both includes species abundance, and we can have an overall look at the species evenness as well. So here for species richness, we couldn't find any significant difference in the species richness throughout the years for the different sites. For the protected sites and non-protected sites. For the species diversity, however, we could find that there was a higher diversity in the protected sites. So for hard coral recruits, if you remember, I said within the lagoon, within the patch reefs, we saw the most protection or the biggest difference between protected and non-protected sites for the branching corals. So now when we think about, okay, how does the community, how do the people that actually fish there that are like in touch with this environment, how do they classify these areas and where do they actually fish and where's the pressure? Then we have a look here. They classified in high seas called Ambahone, in the lagoon and Trone, and in the coral shoals called Andreba. So in a study from Maryann in 2001, she found out that also historically speaking, mainly the Vezo, they fish within the lagoon side. So this is basically where most of the pressure will be. So it's not here in the coral shoals, it's not on the high seas, it's within the lagoon. And that's exactly where the patch reef is also located. So where we could find the biggest difference between for the branching corals, for the control and the protected areas. And that's also why, if you remember, green are the reserve sites. So these are the important sites where we want to protect these species, especially. So they should definitely, Blue Ventures and the community should definitely focus their reserve sites here on the lagoon as well. For the fish belt surveys, another study from Gilchrist et al. From 2020, they investigated the exact same location within the Velondriake area, and here they had a look at reef fish biomass. So they could actually see an increase in fish biomass compared to the control side, which is very important because this is basically what brings some food in here, and more fish biomass is good for fisheries if it's sustainable, obviously. Then we have, they also suggest an increase in reserve sites actually to really be able to benefit the fisheries sector, because they couldn't find any clear evidence that the measurements they had from 2006 until now could really benefit the fishery sector within the Velondriake area. And also I found a high species diversity for protected sites compared to the control sites. However, this study also supported that this is more due to that's more site dependent and not really due to the protection actually. So now we talked a lot about like different indicators and success, but what is actually like the definition of LMMA success? How can we actually really say it's successful or not? First of all, for LMMAs, it's quite important to know they're quite different to MPAs. That in that case, that it's really about sustainable fisheries on the one hand. On the other hand, it's about the well-being of the community. So now it really depends. Okay, what is more important for them when they start this LMMA? Here, that brings me to the next point. To evaluate the success, we have to know what was the initial aim. Was it sustainable fisheries? Was it more the well-being of the community? And here, Blue Ventures really focus on the well-being of the community rather than promoting sustainable fisheries / protecting the environment like how we have it for MPAs, for instance. And then last but not least, so I said we could find like for these 4 different indicators, we could find that there was an impact, a positive impact on the community's well-being. However, can we really associate this well-being impact with this LMMA, with this bottom-up approach, with the community-led environment there? Or is it actually really just because there are a lot of NGOs, there was a lot of publicity, a lot of other agencies working with this together? When we take like the definition of an LMMA to be really bottom-up, without any NGOs, this would have been hardly possible to increase really the well-being of the people. So this is an important factor to say here. Also, when we say, okay, it is successful, and it is definitely successful in terms of well-being, what we could see here, it's hard to say, okay, we take this as a blueprint and take this to another MPA and you do the exact same thing, because it has to be really tailored for the exact same, for this specific community. So in conclusion, so is there a positive impact on the marine environment? Yes, we could see a high protection within the hatcheries for the branching corals. We could see that there's a positive impact on the fish biomass due to the other study as well. However, we couldn't see any improvement in species diversity and richness. Is there a positive impact on communities' well-being? Yes, definitely. In all 4 indicators, we could find social, cultural, health, and governance indicators. So as I said, for Blue Ventures and for the community, for this LMMA, the focus was on this question, communities' well-being, rather than on the environment. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would really like to thank real quick Dr. Natalie Hilmy as well for giving me that opportunity. Maryann Mathew, of course, for being in the office with me and helping me out. And Aldina Mial as well, for your expertise. And Dr. Rashid Soumaila from the University of British Columbia for also giving his expertise for me. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we will open the floor for the last 4 questions, and I see that Jonathan.
For me. No, I'm curious. Apparently, there are some studies about the same subject.
About LMMAs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the same zone?
So in the same zone, there was for really biodiversity, species richness, and fish biomass, I could only find this specific one where they conducted studies. Blue Ventures, obviously, as well, that was the organization where we got the data from. So they are the only ones actually collecting the data there, and they have also internal studies going on as well. Yeah.
Okay. And what are the limitations of this kind of study?
So this kind of study, can I go back and show? Yeah. For this kind of study, especially if we have a look at, wait, can you use this map actually? If we have a look at this map, especially, we had, first of all, I said we had different sample sizes. That was a huge limitation here because we had so many others, so where these DINA laws apply, in comparison to the control sites and in comparison to the reserve sites as well. On the other side, it was also, we have these different reserve sites. So they are very, very, very close to each other as well, also compared to the control side. So it's hard to say, okay, is it like really due to the control, is due to the protection, or is it, let's say, like more site dependent as well? So this is definitely a limitation here. And if I go back to my to this one, is actually good. We have a lot of NAs here. Was just missing data. Missing data. That's a problem. And the data sheets I got from them, the problem was also like that a lot of sites were not annotated. So I had basically 50% of my data I had to throw out because I could not annotate them. That was really a pity. And yeah, so these were the biggest limitations here, I would say.
And you don't have the data before the creation of
2010?
Yeah.
Unfortunately not.
No.
Yeah. That's really like, especially with Blue Ventures, where I also have to say, like, for the fish biodiversity, we had data from 2004 on, but not unfortunately for the hard coral recruits.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, David, for this very nice talk. So regarding this graph, so how can you explain this loss of ranking coral in the control region compared to the LMMA?
We
specific time.
In this specific time. So what's also important to know here in 2016, we also see a drop like for the LMMA, so for the protected site, there was a huge bleaching event in the Western Indian Ocean. So that's one thing to notice. And also for the control, what's also important, I said they are within the patch reef. So that's the graph we're looking at right now, within the patch reef, within the lagoon, where they are mostly, where there's mostly the pressure. So where this community fishes. So if we have a protected zone as well, like within this patch reef here, there are a lot of studies also saying that unfortunately they have to fish somewhere. So they have to sacrifice these specific zones. So it's also definitely possible that the pressure is just moved and concentrated to other zones as well. So this might also be a possibility that there's a significant drop on from 2015.
And do you have access to these? Because at the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about this migration of people coming to the zone. So do you have any information regarding the number of people or when they come in this zone?
That's like the exact number, I don't know right now. And it was more in the, as far as I know, but don't quote me on that, but as far as I know, it was like more in the 80s, 90s, where it's like, and that's where it all started. And that's why in 2006, Blue Ventures came as well and said, like, yeah, we have to do something here. So.
Okay, thanks. And so today, many work talked about this successful LMMA.
Yeah.
So in this concept, so is this work so include also a length of time? I mean, yeah, because the study, I mean, all this data, so all this study, we are comparing all this data collection at one specific time frame. I mean, and then, but to say, okay, it's a successful project or not, but how many years does it need to stay successful to be successful? I mean,
so
do you include?
So the thing is, like, for so it's a very, like, for a very long time actually. So like from, as I said, like from 2004, we have data for not for the coral recruits, but for the fish belt surveys until 2020. So it's a rather long time, I would say, relatively long, especially for locally managed marine areas. So can't say it's successful, let's say up around like from around 10 years, an MPA, or like I would consider this like in the range of an MPA as well, so that they can be considered successful if there's an impact as well. And it also really depends on the size as well. If like, so studies say that bigger MPAs might have more of an impact for fisheries, for example. Smaller MPAs might have more of an impact for the well-being, because like they can concentrate it more. And this is also when I go to my supporting slides regarding this success on well-being here. This study is quite interesting from Ban et al. From 2019. They actually tried to synthesize like 118 articles about the well-being outcomes from marine protected areas. And here they could actually not only find positive outcomes, but also negative outcomes, which is a lot, which is really correlated with conflict as well, and the cost of fishing, since this maybe like they have to increase their fishing efforts. Somewhere else they are banned from fishing, like so they have problems here. And this is mainly conflict potential here as well. And this is specifically for big MPAs, what they found. Oh.
And if you have to start again this project, so what you will change or improve?
The tricky part is like actually the access to the data. Like that's the main point, because since Blue Ventures is like the only organization here who has access to the data, because they are the ones conducting the field surveys as well. That's the main issue here. Unfortunately, you cannot also, like as I said, they have a lot of missing data as well. So it's a bit tricky. You cannot go back in time, so we cannot do it again, unfortunately. But this is the main point would be especially for well-being outcome, because as I said, that's my result here, my main result as well, that they focus also on the well-being here, which is a good point, definitely. But there I would really have liked to do surveys as well with the community there, but like central in Velondriake, and do surveys to ask them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks for the presentation. I have some question. For me, it's not clear how the LMMA can have a positive impact on the population.
On the,
on the well-being. I mean, in such a short term, for me, it's like, I don't know how Blue Venture works, but it's Blue Venture paying for, I don't know, school, healthcare system. So, I mean, it's a strange correlation, no?
Yeah, totally. No, I agree. The thing is, like, that's also, that was my question in the end as well. Like, can we really attribute the, like, this well-being success to the LMMA? Or is it really basically because we have Blue Ventures here, we have other agencies from the worldwide coming there doing social work, let's say that. So the impact, that's why it's also like indirect impact on the well-being here. We have, as I said, social, cultural. Social, that was the biggest impact they really had in terms of gender equality and sexual and reproductive health, where they built these clinics for women as well in terms of contraceptives, and they could actually, that's right. Like they could actually calculate this impact as well. Due to their measurements they did in terms of averted pregnancies, in terms of maternal deaths averted, births averted, and even go as far as infant deaths averted, where you could see definitely an impact. And they could also calculate the total cost savings of their work, basically, which is around 50,000 throughout 3 years, basically the first 3 years where they started the clinical programs as well. But I completely agree with you that I personally wouldn't attribute it to the LMMA, because this could have also technically been possible within an MPA, also without the MPA. However, due to this community involvement, we can gather all of these agencies as well who want to participate in this. So this is definitely a point to argue, but I completely agree.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. It is not clear for me who pay Blue Venture or what. Why Blue Venture come here and not elsewhere? The context is really not clear for.
Why Blue Venture went to Madagascar?
Yes, for this, because Blue Venture is not the government, the Madagascar.
No, they're from the UK, yes.
So why here for, and why is this part of Madagascar and not?
So basically, actually, that's not the only. So they have different focuses, like in different countries. Basically, in Madagascar, that's not the only part they have. They have also in the northwest. They have There were a lot of other LMMAs, marine protected areas, basically. So they just saw that there's a problem. I explained with the migration as well, with the fishing pressure, and they wanted to support this community, basically. Where do they get the money from? Like, how do they, why basically this? I mean, I don't know the financial structure of Blue Ventures, obviously, but as I said, that's like, why do we do a marine protected area here and not there? They just saw the opportunity there. And also what's very important is, as I said, the focus was really, they also, like from the beginning, wanted to focus on the well-being as well, wanted to focus on this community development, and they saw a big chance to start a locally managed marine area with this very interesting population as well, with these semi-nomadic people as well.
Okay.
Which, I mean, we can argue about why specifically these people, but it's a good selling point as well, let's say, if I can just like frankly say that. But it's like we have an opportunity here with this community. This community is very interesting culturally as well, and so why not? Let's do it here. There's a need specifically, and yeah, that's basically my rationale here.
Okay. And Blue Venture is a non-governmental agency, something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
In your conclusion, you say there is an improvement of the social impact. You didn't show any data or result about that. So I assume, but can you confirm that there is a?
Yes.
It's not just in the conclusion.
Yes. So it's basically. Sorry, no worries. So it's basically you were pointing at the social well-being. Yes, exactly. So the social well-being here, that's from Kaplan, Helm, and Bennett. So they defined these 4 indicators, and within this social impact, they defined the gender equality, which is part of the clinical programs are part of this. So basically the actual data, the hard data they have here as the results of this are this with the cumulated costs, you can say,
okay,
from this, and averted deaths, averted abortions, and so on.
Okay. And maybe a last question, what is the size of the protected areas? On the map seems very small, but...
it's rather small. I honestly have to say, I don't know the exact size right now. I don't have the exact...
It's 1 hectare or 100?
No, it's more than 1 hectare. So it's one of the biggest within the Western Indian Ocean as well. So it's a rather big locally managed marine area, but not taking into account marine protected areas, obviously. So it's a rather big LMMA.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think that we're arriving at the end of the big moments. Yes, you can. Congratulations, David. Congratulations, everyone. It has been a tough day. Some of us have to wait for tomorrow to get better, because we have tomorrow session 5. Don't forget, on the human insight in ocean, with Robert, Clara, Angela, and Megan. I hope you will be there online to support them as well. Thank you for the jury on both sessions to have worked for it's a live for 4 hours, but I think it's more like close to 10 hours since the beginning of the day. Thank you a lot. And so see you tomorrow afternoon for the continuation of session 5. We finish with a little video because